Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Are authorities, are communities doing all they can to combat violent crime? With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
It's 12 noon, a very good afternoon. You're with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst, and coming up for you this Monday lunchtime. My friend Rishi Zelenskyy gives Sunak a big hug as the Prime Minister compares the Ukrainian leader to Winston Churchill, and he says the UK is steadfast in its approach and its support. But as the UK promises a big delivery of new weaponry, a warning too that Britain cannot empty its cupboards of military hardware. And the Prime Minister seems to be running out of friends in his own party. In a second Tory fringe conference in as many days, Suella Braverman to criticise her own government's performance on migration. Jacob Rees-Mogg describes Jeremy Hunt's budget as more like a Labour model. But Sir Keir Starmer also in trouble after saying he may allow millions of settled EU migrants to join 16 and 17-year-olds in getting the vote under a Labour government. The Tories accuse him of planning to rig future elections. And hold tight, please. We'll take you on a ride aboard Scotland's new driverless buses. But just why do they still need a captain on board to be safe? First, though, an update on the latest news headlines with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you, and good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 1 minute past 12. The Prime Minister has compared President Zelenskyy's wartime leadership to that of Winston Churchill. The Ukrainian president has met Rishi Sunak at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country retreat, to discuss further military aid. Both leaders discussed sending Western fighter jets to Ukraine, and they anticipated important decisions to be made later on. The meeting comes as the UK's pledged to send hundreds of new long-range attack drones to Ukraine. The Home Secretary will urge the government to stick to its manifesto pledge of reducing overall migration. In a speech at the National Conservatism Conference later, Suella Braverman will argue the UK should train its own workforce of lorry drivers and fruit pickers and be less dependent on low-skilled foreign labour. That's ahead of official figures released later this month, which are expected to show net migration at a record high of between 650,000 and 1 million people over the past year. Former Cabinet Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg told us the UK needs more automation to be more productive.
By relying on low-skilled migration over the last 30 years, we have seen very low increases in productivity. And part of the reason for that, I wouldn't say the whole reason, but part of the reason for that is we haven't mechanised as we should have done. So fruit picking remains an extremely labour-intensive operation. And not all fruits can be picked mechanically, but some can. And why haven't we been investing in the machinery which can then be operated by higher skilled, better paid people? So it's about increasing productivity so that you can increase wages.
Well, speaking at the conference this morning, MP Miriam Cates warned the falling birth rate in the UK poses the biggest threat to British conservatism and Western society. In the 1960s, British women had an average of 2.6 children each. It's now less than 1.6. The MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge says there'll be no future if we don't reverse the trend.
Even without further fall in just 2 generations' time, there will be 40% fewer births than there are today. That is population collapse. You cannot be socially liberal and economically conservative. If you think that government and society should have nothing to say about the conditions that promote strong families, do not be surprised when you end up with a high-tax, high-spend economy, with a nation of broken people dependent on the state.
A ballot on industrial action by senior doctors in England opens today. The British Medical Association says talks with the government to try and resolve the long-running pay dispute remain deadlocked. The union claims the average doctor's salary has dropped by 35% over the past decade, even before inflation's considered. The Health Department says consultants were given a 4.5% pay rise last year and is urging them to carefully consider the effect of further strikes on patients. The ballot will close at the end of June. Meanwhile, 2 teachers' unions have opened new ballots on further strike action. It's after members of the National Association of Head Teachers and the National Education Union rejected the latest pay offer from the government. Voting will close at the end of July, with potential strike action to take place in the autumn term. This is GB News. More from me shortly. Now, though, it's back to Mark.
Tamsin, thank you very much indeed. So, Rishi Sunak echoing Winston Churchill in welcoming President Zelenskyy to Chequers, the first foreign leader he's received at the Prime Ministerial country retreat, saying that the UK was steadfast in its support for Ukraine. The two men have been speaking in the past few minutes. This is what they had to say.
It's been a pleasure to welcome my friend Vladimir back to the UK. The conflict is a pivotal moment. Ukraine is bravely defending itself against Russian aggression, but at this moment it's been really good for us to have the time to talk together in private about the support that the UK is giving and how we can make sure that that support is not just here for today but into the future as well, to ensure that Ukraine and its people triumph not just on the battlefield militarily but also stand up for those values of freedom, democracy and the rule of law that we all hold very dear. We've had some very good conversations and Vladimir, it's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. First of all, for me and for our team, it's a privilege that you host us here today, Rishi. And thank you, especially you and your government for supporting us. Really, at this moment, like you said, at the moment of challenges, the moment for us, for our society, our people, especially for our soldiers, moment is tough, difficult, but anyway, we need success, and I'm happy that in this way we are in way of preparing very important counteroffensive steps. You are with us, together with us, all Great Britain, you and your government. It's very important. So thank you very much for all support. Of course, with all this best attitude to our people from your people, but of course we concentrate on military support. And thank you very much for this package that you prepared. Great, huge, really. What can save the lives for our people. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Vladimir. Right, we'll take some questions. Yes.
Mr. President, you made it very clear you need more advanced weapons more quickly. Is it fair to say that you cannot begin your new counter-offensive until you get them? And Prime Minister, today the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has warned that Russia views the new UK military package extremely negatively. Does that worry you?
Yes, thank you very much for your question. We really need some more time, not too much. We'll be ready, in some time. I want to be very honest with you. I can't share with you some days. I just don't want to prepare. Not for our friends. There are no secrets from our friends, but there are some secrets from our neighbors. That's why we have to prepare. And I'm here not only because of this support, but of course, including this support, it will help us to be more strong. But also to thank you to your people, to government. It's very, very important now when some countries, not all of of the whole world, but some countries are near with us from first days of full-scale war, and I'm thankful that Great Britain is one of these countries.
Look, it's interesting to hear from the Kremlin. What I'd say is, Russia has conducted an unprovoked and illegal attack on the Ukrainian people. It is carrying out horrific war crimes, and something Vladimir and I have been speaking about, just awful treatment of its citizens. And as we said right at the beginning, the UK will remain steadfast in supporting Ukraine and its people to defend itself against that aggression. When Vladimir was last here some months ago, I talked then about the provision of long-range weapons because of the capability that they would offer. I'm pleased we're the first country to be able to do that, and I'm pleased that they will make a difference to the defence of Ukraine, and we will keep providing support, as you've seen today, with long-range offensive drones, for example, more anti-aircraft, and there will be further support to come, and that's what we've been talking about today. But I think it's important for the Kremlin to also know that we're not going away. Right, we are here for the long term. We remain steadfast in wanting to defend Ukraine, not just now to reclaim its rightful territory, but also to ensure that Ukraine has the means to defend itself into the future as well. And that's another topic of conversation that we've had today, is about the security arrangements that we should put in place amongst allied countries for Ukraine for the long term, to ensure that it can defend itself and provide effective deterrence against future Russian aggression.
President Zelensky, when you were last in the UK, you made a plea for Western fighter jets. How are negotiations going? And Prime Minister, where does the UK stand on that matter?
Thank you very much. Today we spoke about the jets, very important topic for us, because we can't control the sky, you know it. So I think you know everything deeply, because we're real partners. Rishi knows all the details, what's going on our battlefield. Thank you very much. And we want to create this jets coalition, and I'm very positive with it. We spoke about it, and I see that in the closest time you will hear some, I think, very important decisions, but we have to work a little bit more on it.
Yes, look, we are going to be a key part of the coalition of countries that provides that support to Vladimir and Ukraine. Now, it is not a straightforward thing, as Vladimir and I have been discussing, to build up that fighter combat aircraft capability. It's not just the provision of planes, it's also the training of pilots and all the logistics to go alongside that. Now, the UK can play a big part of that. One thing we will be doing, starting actually relatively soon, is training of Ukrainian pilots, and that's something that we've discussed today. We're ready to implement those plans in relatively short order, which will mean that we're training Ukrainian citizens to become absolutely combat-ready aircraft pilots, and particularly whether it comes to NATO tactics as well, because that's an important part of the long-term relationship between our countries. So we've had very good productive discussions on that today. Other countries are involved. I'm talking to those leaders. I'll be doing more of that this week in my international engagement, and we're very keen to build that coalition of countries to give Vladimir and his people the aircraft support that they need.
So that was that news conference at Chequers, the Prime Ministerial Centre, where Rishi Sunak has been the first to receive Volodymyr Zelensky, and interestingly, both using Christians' names, Rishi, Vladimir. But in terms of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, the UK would remain steadfast. We are not going away, he said. In terms of President Zelensky, talking about very important counter-offensive steps. We need some more time, not much. But then in terms of the jets, we have to work a little more on it. Let's get the views of our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, who joins us in the studio. And first of all, I mean, the body language and the first name terms, clearly there's quite a link between these two men.
There are, and they've met many times now.
Yep.
We have to remember, of course, the first visit, I think, to somewhere else in Europe outside of Ukraine for President Zelensky was the UK back in February. I was there when he addressed both houses of Parliament. I think what's interesting about it is that they're both kind of gaining from this relationship, if you like. Let's be honest about that. You know, Rishi Sunak has made a concerted campaign since he became Prime Minister to carry on that kind of effort that Boris Johnson initially made this time last year, to show that the UK would be kind of front and centre when it came to being on Ukraine's side, being the biggest supporter, if you like, in Europe. for Ukraine, not just in terms of rhetoric, but also in terms of money and in terms of weapons. And for President Zelensky, you know what? Anyone who's going to be willing to supply him weapons or extra support of any need is going to be his best friend.
Yeah.
And we did see, I think we also have to remember, he's been in Germany over the last couple of days. He's been a lot more critical about Germany. He's been in France and the Vatican too. This is a part of a charm offensive.
But in terms of the hardware, we understand from what they've been discussing, perhaps drones, perhaps anti-aircraft missiles. No decision as yet, it seems, on aircraft. We have to work a little more on that in terms of what he called a Jets coalition. But interesting that, again, we're talking about training Ukrainian pilots. Does that mean those Ukrainian pilots would actually be in the cockpit of British jets?
Yeah, I think almost certainly. I mean, I think there's some 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers who've been trained here in the UK since the war began, when I say the war began, I should say from 2013, so over the last 4 or 5 years rather than just in the last 15 months or so. But yes, I think that is entirely plausible. They talked about that back in February. I think there are a few complications here with jets. First of all, it is the supply of where the jets would come from. Now, my understanding to date is that actually, if Ukraine were to be supplied jets, there would initially be the old Soviet MiG jets that Poland has, because that's the system that Ukrainians are most familiar with.
MiG-29s and so on, yeah.
I think there's also a massive added complication here where the supply of jets, and we saw from some of those leaked intelligence reports a couple of weeks ago from Washington that there are concerns that the Ukrainian Air Force may simply collapse within weeks. Is that is an escalation. I mean, what happens again if, a British fighter jet piloted by Ukrainian, though, gets into a dogfight with a Russian aircraft, and that's always the tension and concern. From the Ukrainian point of view, Mark, they're really frustrated, though, where, they have to really push to somewhere where it seems the West inevitably finds themselves anyway.
As if they're going begging as well. But what do we make, then, of Tobias Ellwood, the chair of the Defence Select Committee, saying the UK cannot empty its cupboards of military hardware to keep supplying Ukraine with weapons? That's quite a telling intervention.
It is, and it's a real recognition that there's no sign that this war's going to come to an end anytime soon. And this is not just a thought process in London, in Whitehall, in the Ministry of Defence, in Parliament. It is one actually in Washington that you hear now increasingly. It's one I think you'll also hear in Germany and France as well. In essence, what the UK and others only have access to so much military hardware.
Yeah.
Now, there's been a massive ramping up of manufacture of defence equipment here and elsewhere over the last year or so, but still there'll have to be a decision made at some point where we have given as much as we possibly can. And that maybe is where Russia's trying to take this. You drag
playing
it up
a long game.
Well, because at the end of the day, if they are going through the amount of equipment they are currently going through, it is only a matter of time before people go, I'm sorry, there's literally nothing left in the cupboard.
Well, on that very topic, let's bring in our General Lord Richard Dannatt, who can join us, former head of the British Army. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Hopefully you were able to hear both the Prime Minister and President Zelensky there speaking at Chequers. I thought it was quite interesting what President Zelensky was saying about very important counter-offensive steps. We need some more time, but not much.
Yes, well, it's a completely open secret that Ukraine is planning a counter-offensive, and that Western countries such as ourselves, United States and other European countries in particular, are making it possible for that to happen by way of training soldiers here in the Ukraine. And we know we've trained 15,000 in this country, and we've given them a lot of military hardware and ammunition. So this offensive is going to happen. Now, quite rightly, President Zelensky did not say exactly when it was going to happen. And indeed, we don't need to know that. Equally, their plans as to where they're going to attack, in what manner, and other details are things that they need to keep operationally secure. But it's an open secret there will be a counter-offensive, and it must succeed.
The question is, what sort of air cover would they have for that? I mean, we have the Prime Minister again saying that we will be training Ukrainian pilots. Do we then take or draw from that they will be flying at some stage Typhoons, RAF-type aircraft, rather than the MiG-29s and the F-16s and so on?
Well, it's difficult to answer that question. Much more likely that the flying training that we will enable the Ukrainians to benefit from will allow them to fly MiG-29s and F-16s. If we were to give them some Typhoons, it would mean setting up another whole logistics supply line.
Yeah.
And I'm not terribly sure that that is the most efficient way of going forward. Rather better using this term of a jets coalition, that we contribute with training and that countries that have got MiG-29s and F-16s, they contribute those aircraft. That, I think, is the best way. But it's going to be in the medium to long term. The offensive that's coming off quite shortly will struggle with the air situation. The Ukrainian Air Force has got some capability. We've increased the amount of anti-air capability that they've got, but they will have to struggle not with the situation of air superiority. They'll have to be much more canny in the way that they maneuver and bring their combat power to bear, bearing in mind that they are fairly exposed from the air. But it's another interesting facet of this campaign so far that the Russian Air Force has been pretty conspicuous by its absence. So it'll be a very interesting response by the Russian forces, whether they do take the risk of putting some of their high-tech fighters into the fight in the airspace above Ukraine when it comes to the counter-offensive. We'll have to watch that one with interest.
And I know you've touched on this in terms of the timing, that they've really got to get on with it, because you've drawn this point that the longer this goes on, the more danger is of the European and the Western support fracturing or just becoming a little fatigued with it.
Yes, I mean, this counter-offensive will start in the not-too-distant future, and it must be successful in this campaign season. In other words, the remains of the spring and the summer and in the early autumn. That's when it's got to come to a decision, hopefully, in the Ukrainians' favour on the battlefield, as I say, this year. Otherwise, there is a danger of war fatigue in the West, in the United States and elsewhere.
Yeah.
And time is therefore on Putin's side. So this year is absolutely critical, and getting this counter-offensive right, the right time, in the right place, in the right way, is the way the Ukrainians are going to defeat the Russians in Ukraine on the battlefield this year.
Well, we have the Prime Minister saying we are steadfast, we are not going away. What do you make, therefore, of Tobias Ellwood's intervention, the chair of the Defence Select Committee, saying the UK cannot empty its cupboards of military hardware to keep supplying Ukraine with weapons?
Well, in the medium to long term, he's absolutely right. But in the short term, we can afford to take a risk to give the Ukrainians what they need to achieve the success that I've just been talking about, that they must achieve this year. Now, of course, it's incumbent on us that we replenish our stocks as quickly as possible, and it's incumbent on the Ukrainians, with our support, that in the medium to long term, they grow their own military capability so that they can increasingly stand on their own feet to protect themselves in future from Russia, whether that's as members of NATO or just being supported, as they are now, by NATO member countries.
And then final thought, what does victory look like? When do we actually say they've succeeded in expelling Russia, or at least achieving their goals that they want?
Well, if you take President Zelensky's definition of victory, it's when they have expelled all Russian soldiers from the Donbass and eastern Ukraine and from Crimea. Now, whether they will be able to do that by defeating the Russian army in detail, or whether in fact it will be achieved by achieving a measure of decisive effect, which would lead the Russians to conclude that they want to withdraw, that's the open question. And that's what's going to be settled and decided on the battlefield this year.
General Lord Richard Dannett, thank you very much for joining us on GB News once more. Thank you for your time. And, of course, more reaction to come to what we've just heard from Chequers there, and what the next few weeks may bring on the battlefield as well. Coming up here on GB News Live, more on the political front. Keir Starmer's plans to allow EU national migrants to vote in future general elections. The Tories say it's being used to rig future elections. Are they right or wrong? More in a moment.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
Is the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, Sir Keir Starmer's indicated his common sense, the phrase he's used, to allow EU nationals who've worked for years in the UK to vote in a general election. Labour considering extending the franchise under its manifesto plans. The leader reportedly launching a package of proposals to also include handing votes to 16 and 17-year-olds. But the Tory party has accused him of trying to rig future elections by handing votes to those who they say are more likely to vote Labour. Well, joining us now is our deputy political editor, Tom Harwood. I nearly put you in the senior position there because we had Darren in the studio just a few minutes ago. However, let's address this EU situation first, because a lot of people might be a bit confused thinking, how can an EU citizen vote in a British election? This is when they have what they call settled status.
Right, there are about 3.4 million EU citizens who've achieved settled status, who've filled out all of the forms and are allowed to live and work in Britain. Settled status in Britain, but haven't become British citizens.
Right.
Now, this group of people can vote in Scottish parliamentary elections. They've recently been allowed to vote in Welsh parliamentary elections and in those council elections as well, in those devolved countries. What this proposal in this leaked Labour document over the weekend was saying is that that group of people should also be allowed to vote in general elections, which has raised some eyebrows, particularly because this is a group of people who predominantly are in sort of the southeast of England, who could tip the balance in many seats. It's been pointed out that, for example, Uxbridge and South Ruislip is one of those seats. The seats of the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has a large percentage of these
Big
people.
Polish contingent, of course.
Certainly as well. Although many people who have come to the United Kingdom as migrants for many years have decided to become citizens.
Yeah.
And of course, there isn't a ban on migrants voting in general elections if they've gone through the process to become a citizen. The change that Labour is considering is getting rid of that requirement and saying that anyone with settled status, even if they're not a British citizen, would be able to vote in general elections.
So they could still be a citizen of a European country, but vote in a British election?
That is the proposal. That is currently the case in Scottish parliamentary elections. But the Labour Party is mulling over the idea of having that be the case in general elections in the UK. And people have rightly sort of raised an eyebrow at why this change would be necessary. The example that Starmer gave on the radio this morning was if someone's lived here for 20 or 30 years, if they pay taxes in Britain, why shouldn't they vote? Taxation without representation. And it's a compelling argument until you realise if someone's lived here for 20 or 30 years, they've had the option to become a citizen. Why haven't they chosen to become a citizen?
Yeah. Now, the other aspect, of course, is widening the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds as well. I mean, this has been gone through in years past. Again, he's using this phrase, common sense. But there are those who say, well, hold on, are 16 and 17-year-olds politically adroit enough to actually make decisions on their own behalf?
Of course, the counter-argument to that is that there are many people who are perhaps older who might not be the most adroit of the nation.
And serve in the armed forces at that
Well,
age.
the interesting point here is that recently, 16 and 17-year-olds and the rights of those groups of people have been moving in the other direction. So you are no longer allowed to fight if you're 16 and 17-year-old in the army, because that goes against the UN Convention on Child Soldiers.
Right.
You are no longer allowed to get married if you're 16 and 17. That came in February this year because of the exploitation that we saw, particularly in some minority communities in this country.
Arranged marriages and so on.
And also, you now need to remain in education or training until the age of 18 in a way that wasn't the case a few years ago when lots of people would leave school at 16.
So this would be going against that trend?
This would be going against that clear trend of potentially not seeing 16 and 17-year-olds as adults. So it is a bit inconsistent, particularly because many of those who propose this change of lowering the franchise are exactly the same sort of people who say we should raise the smoking age, or raise the drinking age, or change the way a driving licence operates until the age of 25. And all of these different ideas, it seems that there's a remarkable inconsistency there.
On quite a few fronts, it seems. There we are. To be discussed, as ever, Tom, thank you very much indeed. Now, 2 teacher unions have opened their ballots for more strike action after rejecting the government's recent pay offer. Members of the National Association of Head Teachers and the National Education Union rejecting those pay and working conditions offers. Balloting now members to vote on industrial action today. And after a deadlock with the government, senior doctors in England, consultants also voting today to decide whether they will strike in their continuing dispute over pay in the health service. Well, let's actually now speak to our political reporter, Catherine Forster, who can update us. And, of course, we should reflect the RCN. The nurses are down in Brighton with their conference discussing maybe whether they pursue further industrial action as well. It seems that the government just can't get this yoke away from its neck.
No, it really can't. And of course, it does need to bring an end to these strikes, doesn't it? There's a general election coming next year. If, heaven forbid, strikes were still rumbling on, ultimately, a lot of people might hold the government responsible, although, of course, the government is putting the blame squarely at the foot of the unions. So today, the ballot reopens for National Education Union and National Association of Head Teachers for state schools in England. They roundly rejected by 98% on a 2/3 turnout the previous offer from the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan. It was 5 to 9% for last year, a £1,000 one-off payment, and 4.5% for the year that we're currently in. Now, there is a huge crisis in terms of teacher retention and recruitment. Teachers are saying that they're hugely worse off than they were before the financial crisis. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, independent of course, has said that by 2014, teachers will on average be 12% worse off than in 2010. So Gillian Keegan has taken a pretty hard line on this, but the teachers are not budging at all. Of course, children beginning GCSEs and A-levels this week, most of those classes have been protected, but actually a lot of children have missed a week of school. And as you said, the senior doctors will be joining the junior doctors potentially, and the RCN also planning to ballot again on strike action.
On we go, as ever. But let's see, of course, what happens in terms of the ballots themselves before they decide on that industrial action. Catherine, down at Westminster, thank you for that. Staying with the politics, are the Conservatives beginning to turn on their own Prime Minister as Home Secretary Suella Braverman now starts to question, seemingly, migration policy? More on that in a moment. First, an update on all the news headlines with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom at 12:34. The UK is to start training Ukrainian pilots to fly Western fighter jets in the near future. The Prime Minister greeted Ukrainian President Zelenskyy at Chequers and said that providing warplanes wasn't straightforward, but that the UK will be part of a coalition of countries helping Ukraine in its war effort. The Prime Minister has compared President Zelenskyy's wartime leadership to that of Winston Churchill. The meeting comes as the UK has pledged to send hundreds of new long-range attack drones to Ukraine.
One thing we will be doing, starting actually relatively soon, is training of Ukrainian pilots, and that's something that we've discussed today. We're ready to implement those plans in relatively short order, which will mean that we're training Ukrainian citizens to become absolutely combat-ready aircraft pilots.
The Home Secretary will urge the government to stick to its manifesto pledge of reducing overall migration. In a speech at the National Conservative Conference later, Suella Braverman will argue the UK should train its own workforce of lorry drivers and fruit pickers and be less dependent on low-skilled foreign labour. That's ahead of official figures, which are expected to show net migration at a record high of between 650,000 and 1 million people within the last year. A ballot on industrial action by senior doctors in England opens today. The British Medical Association says talks with the government to try and resolve the long-running pay dispute remain deadlocked. The Health Department says consultants were given a 4.5% pay rise last year and is urging them to carefully consider the effect of further strikes on patients. The ballot will close at the end of June. Meanwhile, 2 teacher unions have opened new ballots on further strike action. It's after members of the National Association of Head Teachers and the National Education Union rejected the latest pay offer from the government. Voting will close at the end of July, with potential strike action to take place in the autumn term. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are. We don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Live. Now, in a speech later today, the Home Secretary expected to warn that Britain has become too dependent on foreign labour. Well, there has been speculation of increasing party divisions over immigration and migration, some members more keen than others to stress the benefits of migration for economic growth. Indeed, this morning, Trade Minister Nigel Huddleston insisting that high numbers of low-skilled workers were often a good thing. Well, it comes as new Met migration figures are predicted to hit a record level of close to 1 million people this year. That's expected in a week or so, the official figure. But the Home Secretary likely to warn that Britain must not forget how to do things for ourselves, calling for homegrown fruit pickers and HG drivers. Well, joining us now, political reporter Olivia Utley, who is at this conference today. Olivia, just to update us on what precisely this conference is, it's the second in as many days on, should we say, the right wing of the party, which seems openly critical of the Prime Minister on quite a few issues.
Absolutely. I think what we can see both from the conference in Bournemouth over the weekend and from the start of this conference today is that there is brewing dissatisfaction on the right of the Tory party, if you like, over Rishi Sunak's leadership. When Rishi Sunak was made leader in September last year, it was felt in all wings of the Tory party that for the sake of party unity, he should be given a chance. And that sort of fragile unity has held for the last 6 or 7 months. After the local election drubbing a couple of weeks ago, that unity is beginning to fracture. And today we've seen rising star of the Conservative Party, Miriam Cates MP, a red waller, very vocal MP, be explicitly critical of Jeremy Hunt's childcare policy, saying that it's anti-conservative and anti-mother. Well, that's pretty interesting from someone who you would expect to be wanting to climb the ranks of the Tory party. We've also seen Jacob Rees-Mogg. I mean, he has criticised Rishi Sunak before, but this is perhaps the most overt criticism that we've seen. He said that Rishi Sunak choosing only to scrap 400 of the 6,000 EU laws was pathetically unambitious. Those are the words he used. And as you said earlier there, Mark, we are expecting Suella Braverman this afternoon to go off-piste and say that she believes that net migration needs to come substantially down. Now, all of these policies are very popular among the sort of Tory grassroots Conservative members in the country. So all of these politicians are sort of putting their neck on the line in terms of government unity, but they know that they'll be very popular with voters in their own constituencies. So it'll be really, really interesting to see how this plays out. But for the moment, what we're seeing, the two major themes of this conference are the plunging birth rate. We've heard almost every speaker has talked about that, and of course those immigration figures. And that's very timely indeed, given that in the next few weeks we're expecting to hear that immigration to the UK in 2023 is between 700,000 and 1 million. It peaked at 500,000 last year, so this is certainly a very live issue.
Olivia, at a very noisy conference there, even though they're not actually in the chamber at the moment. Thank you for that. Back to you a little later, and of course we'll have an update as Suella Braverman makes that speech. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Turkey's relationship with the West hanging in the balance, it seems. Last night's general election vote likely now to lead to a runoff, as neither candidate secured an outright majority. The vote to decide Turkey's foreign policy direction, the challenger Kılıçdaroğlu vowing to build a stronger relationship with both NATO and the EU. Let's get more light on what's been going on now. We're joined by Melda Doğan, who can update us, a journalist based in Istanbul, and many people there holding their breath, I think, Melda, in these last hours, but seemingly it does look now as if both men are going to have to go back and try again.
Yes, indeed, it's correct. Now, none of the candidates, nor Recep Tayyip Erdoğan or Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, has achieved to pass the 50% threshold. So now we're waiting for the second round of elections, which will be held in 2 weeks' time. Now, the kingmaker of this election will actually be the third candidate, Sinan Oğan, who achieved to get 5% of the votes. He's a nationalistic leader, and apparently his voter base will decide who will be the winner of these elections on May 28th. Now, the general mood in Istanbul, I'm on the street now, literally talking to people, how they feel about the result is very mixed, while the opposition seems to be quite unhappy and disappointed by the result, as the coalition of six was expected to get a higher result, a higher percentage in these elections. There is a bit of disappointment at this stage, but we will see how it will end in 2 weeks' time at the second round of the elections. We can say we were expecting a very high turnout, which really happened last night. So 88% of the voters went to cast their vote on the ballot. So we have a very high turnout in this case. But one surprising fact about last night's election results was the results coming from the earthquake region. Apparently, the earthquake didn't really change the preference of the people who live in the earthquake-hit regions. 50,000 people have lost their lives. Yes. But indeed, the results haven't changed at all. And I can say that most of the Turkish people have preferred to vote based on identities and their political preferences rather than the mismanagement of the earthquake and the economic crisis, which is really hitting back the country.
Well, that's very interesting because, of course, huge problems with inflation. And as you say, the criticism of Erdogan, the earthquake relief effort, but it's still sticking with the secular and the conservative religious divide that's been the political landscape, if you like, there for many years.
Indeed, indeed. Despite all the problems with the management, there are still people on the ground. I have been traveling in Anatolia, in Anatolian towns where Erdogan's base is. What they were also pretty much complaining about the economy. But one thing that I heard a lot was that, yes, the economy is not doing well. Yes, we're not happy with Erdogan's governance, but we also don't want to vote for the opposition. And they had two main reasons. First of all, it's a bit of nationalist sentiment. They were not happy that the opposition was partnering with HDP, which Erdogan deems the Kurdish party being related to the PKK. So that was one reason. The second reason why they didn't want to vote for the opposition was also that Erdogan using religion as a political tool. So in many cases, he has threatened his voter base that if the opposition comes to power, they might put bans on hijab again, or maybe close some of the religious schools. So that was another concern. And even though people are struggling economically or they're not happy with the management, they just opt to vote for Erdogan for basically really more of a religious sense and nationalism.
Melda, thank you very much for updating us there in Istanbul, and of course the whole thing to be rerun once again, so we'll be speaking to you in a few days. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
So the runoff is in train. Now, we've seen driverless cars, driverless trains, indeed. Now, a driverless bus service has started to run between Fife and Edinburgh Park train station in Scotland, a 14-mile route being served by 5 single-decker autonomous buses. Let's cross to Edinburgh now and speak to our man, Tony Maguire, who hopefully we put her on board to give it a trial run. What was it like, Tony?
I have to say I haven't been on yet, unfortunately, Stagecoach. We're watching themselves today and not wanting any filming done. However, I had the pleasure of talking to lots and lots of smiley, happy people coming off of that bus. I've never seen such a queue of people seem so delighted to have ridden the bus. And certainly, as you said, there are 5 of these autonomous buses now making roughly about a half-hour journey between Fife and Edinburgh Park here in Edinburgh, and it's one of these world first trials. So what we're seeing here is Cav 4 Phase 1. Later we'll see a bit of an extension up to Dunfermline, and then beyond that we'll see slightly more vehicles and slightly different vehicles. I'm joined here by some people who are from Napier University in Edinburgh. They're doing some surveys with the passengers to kind of find out what's working and what isn't, and what the public perception is, because as we all know by this point, AI can kind of be a hit or a miss in news headlines, but certainly it would appear, speaking to the passengers, that it's a massive hit with these buses. And certainly as we go even further in the future, the plan is to have fully autonomous, no driver and no captain buses. Now captains, let's just talk about that for a second. It's not the Jolly Roger, but it is the Jolly Stagecoach. Now each of these buses has a captain as well as the driver. The driver is sitting kind of prepped to grab the wheel, but about 90% of the trip is autonomous at this point as it drives over the iconic Forth Road Bridge. Meanwhile, the captain's in the back with the passengers who have their seatbelts on at this early stage in the trial, and she's just asking any questions and also giving some kind of factoids and information for the passengers as well. So hopefully maybe by the end of my shift I'll get a chance to ride one and actually feel what it's like. But you know, all the passengers I spoke to today, they seem to think this is the future and this is where it's all heading, and it's certainly, speaking to some of the Stagecoach personnel who are here on site, they're saying this technology has been a growing process. This has been a process. It's not just a switch that's been flipped to kind of start launching autonomous buses.
Right.
Actually, a lot of the buses that you take part in every day are probably have a lot of this technology in them.
Yeah, although I'm still trying to scratch my head as to why you have a driverless bus that's got a driver and a captain. But anyway, there we are. We'll be back to you in the next hour to discuss that a bit further. But good to see that everyone's enjoying that trip, even though there's someone at the wheel, not actually moving it. As ever, Tony, thank you for that. More for you a little later. But let's move on to sport now, because Aidan is joining us in the studio. And we've got, one win from 3 matches for Man City, and they're home and dry.
That's right, yeah. I mean, I think they'll probably win all 3, to be honest with you, notwithstanding the fact they've got Champions League data in the week against Real Madrid at home, which is not a foregone conclusion. They're fancied to win. They took the draw in the first leg, but Real Madrid are hugely experienced. But look, I mean, yesterday they threw down the gauntlet to Arsenal. They went to Everton, who had their best result in a couple of years, the previous Saturday or the previous weekend when they beat Brighton 5-1, and Arsenal just couldn't match what they served up at Everton. I never felt City were out of the race. I always felt they'd probably win the title. But in a season when the World Cup has disrupted everything and concertina the fixtures either side, it was always going to be the team with the strongest squad who came good at the right time. And lo and behold, Pep Guardiola concentrated on having his players fit this season. They've only got one injury. It's in April. We're in May now.
So that's what training and prep.
Well, yeah, I mean,
because obviously, you know, people say, is it the money? Money's bought success, or is it Guardiola who's managed the team?
It's a bit of everything. The money is the overwhelming factor, I would suggest. I mean, some would say that once again, Manchester City are going to win their 4th title in 5 years, and therefore the Premier League is proof that it's up for the it's available to the highest bidder.
And yet you've got Brighton, who beat Arsenal, who haven't got the sort of money that Newcastle or Man City have got, but they've got this sort of management expertise and an owner that applies sort of social science, if you like.
It's a betting algorithm almost. Yeah. They target undervalued players, and Brighton can sign a player from literally anywhere on the globe. They can sign a player from Blackburn's reserves, or they can sign a player from the second division in Peru.
But they've done the stats on it.
They have, but, and the same with Brentford as well, it's not just about stats. At some point along the line, there has to be top-level coaching, good old-fashioned, getting him on the training pitch and making him up to first-team level. So it's not all about stats, it's also good old-fashioned principles as well.
OK, and talk about good old-fashioned coaching. Pochettino, is he going to be at Chelsea?
He's going to be announced later this week, we understand. Yeah, I mean, I think Chelsea have missed a trick to a degree here. They've been stumbling around, haven't they, in the last few weeks, looking at, flirting with different managers. Meanwhile, Frank Lampard's in there, not able to buy a win. Obviously, with the exception of Bournemouth.
Although he recognised he was in there as a caretaker.
Oh, yeah, he did. But I think Pochettino should have been in probably 2 or 3 weeks ago. There's no better way to assess a squad, because they're going to have to lose a lot of players. No better way to assess a squad than if you've got half a dozen games at the end of one season to take a look at them. It's harder to do that in pre-season. He's going to have to make some ruthless choices. But I did his first interview in English football, 2013, when at Southampton. He was in Spanish, actually. And I just knew he would go to the top. He had something about him. And, he drew his first game very ignominiously against Everton. He kept them up that season. They got to the top 7 or top 8 the following season. He went to Spurs. Brilliant run there as well. It's not fair to say, he didn't win a trophy. I mean, he took up a side that was floundering and got them back into the top 4. They finished runners-up in 2017 behind Leicester. They got to the League Cup final, lost to Chelsea. And, of course, they got to the Champions League final, which Tottenham probably won't do for many years to come.
Well, Southampton perhaps could have done with a bit of that magic this time around. I mean, they're down. Leicester...
it's
probably
2 from 4. Not necessarily, no. I mean, I think that the one thing, all those teams have got tough fixtures to come. So there's plenty of football to be played. Leeds are still alive. They played well, showed some good spirit, not just at Man City the week before, but also against Newcastle. Sam Allardyce was absolutely determined, and he imparted this onto his player beforehand. We've got to get something from this game. They've got a point. Now, their future is decided by the other clubs. It's not in their hands, but some of those fixtures look extremely tough.
And what is it when a club goes down? I mean, how damaging is it to go down that level and lose the money and players want to move on? And do you have to rebuild from scratch then?
Not really, no, because you have parachute money now. So if you basically got 2 years to get back up. You look at Bournemouth, they got relegated in the COVID season in 2020. And they got back by the skin of their teeth in 2022. They survived this season. They might well be back on track. The parachute money ceases after year 2.
And
that's why Swansea, for example...
So they've got to turn it around quickly.
Swansea, under Graham Potter, they went down... Potter took over in the summer of 2018. They didn't get up in the first season. Steve Cooper took over, who's now at Nottingham Forest. Playoffs in the second season. They needed to go up that year. And that's why now you're seeing Swansea drop down to the Championship, and who knows where they're going to go. But you've got 2 years, basically, Mark.
Let's celebrate the women's game as well.
Absolutely.
Record...
Attendance for a world record for a domestic for a domestic game. Yeah, absolutely outstanding. Chelsea winning it again. I think it might have a bearing on the league campaign as well, because they're vying positions 1 and 2 in the WSL. Man United are the outliers here. They're new to this. They're the Chelsea of 2003 under Roman Abramovich, because they came to the party very late. They weren't really interested in it, and I don't know if it was PR or whatever. They decided to invest in it.
And we had the Prince of Wales there as is he president of the FA? Is that his official title?
Yeah, he is. That's right.
So
he's had that role for a long time. Yeah.
But in terms of the
you see him at Villa sometimes as well.
Well, indeed, with George, I think goes together, isn't it? But in terms of those watching the match, I mean, is there an indication that the game will encourage, you see all these young kids as well at these women's games?
The showpiece finals are really great events. You don't want to be going to a big stadium and there being empty seats. That's really well attended yesterday, as we said. My concern is the WSL, the actual week in, week out, bread and butter league games on a week-to-week basis have not shown a marked improvement in attendances, and that has to improve.
Still a bit of work to do.
Absolutely, there is. Yeah.
Aidan, as ever, thank you for taking us through all that. As the season's nearly over, but we'll update people, of course, as those matches.
I don't stop over the summer, by the way.
No, indeed, indeed. Keep going, keep pedalling. Coming up in this next hour here on GB News Live, we've got President Zelensky and the Prime Minister meeting. What's been promised to my friend Rishi and my friend Vladimir Zelensky. Will update you from that meeting at Chequers. All latest for you in a moment. Stay with us.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The people's channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
It's 1 o'clock. A very good afternoon. You're with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst, and coming up for you this Monday lunchtime. My friend Rishi Zelenskyy gives Sunak a big hug as the Prime Minister says Britain is not going away. We're steadfast, he says. The UK to train Ukrainian pilots to be combat ready, but still not providing any jets, it seems. And the Prime Minister seems to be running out of friends in his own party. In a second Tory fringe conference in as many days, Suella Braverman to criticise her own government's performance on migration. And Jacob Rees-Mogg describes Jeremy Hunt's budget as more like a Labour model. Meanwhile, Sir Keir Starmer is also in trouble after saying he may allow millions of settled EU migrants to join 16 and 17-year-olds in getting the vote under a Labour government. The Tories accuse him of planning to rig future elections. And hold tight, please. We'll be taking you on ride aboard Scotland's new driverless buses. But just why do they still need a captain on board, just to be safe? First, an update on the latest news headlines with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 1 minute past 1. The UK is to start training Ukrainian pilots to fly Western fighter jets in the near future. The Prime Minister has met Ukrainian President Zelenskyy at Chequers and said that providing warplanes wasn't straightforward at the moment. The Prime Minister has compared President Zelenskyy's wartime leadership to that of Winston Churchill. The meeting comes as the UK's pledged to send hundreds of new long-range attack drones to Ukraine.
One thing we will be doing, starting actually relatively soon, is training of Ukrainian pilots, and that's something that we've discussed today. We're ready to implement those plans in relatively short order, which will mean that we're training Ukrainian citizens to become absolutely combat-ready aircraft pilots.
Well, President Zelenskyy has said the fighter jets are an important issue for his country's defence.
Today we spoke about the jets, very important topic for us, because we can't control the sky, you know it. So I think you know everything deeply, because we're real partners. Rishi knows all the details, what's going on our battlefield. Thank you very much. And we want to create this jets coalition, and I'm very positive with it.
The Home Secretary will urge the government to stick to its manifesto pledge of reducing overall migration. In a speech at the National Conservatism Conference later, Suella Braverman will argue the UK should train its own workforce of lorry drivers and fruit pickers and be less dependent on low-skilled foreign labour. That's ahead of official figures released later this month, which are expected to show net migration at a record high of between 650,000 and 1 million people over the past year. Former Cabinet Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg told GB News the UK needs more automation to be more productive.
By relying on low-skilled migration over the last 30 years, we have seen very low increases in productivity. And part of the reason for that, I wouldn't say the whole reason, but part of the reason for that is we haven't mechanised as we should have done. So fruit picking remains an extremely labour-intensive operation. And not all fruits can be picked mechanically, but some can. And why haven't we been investing in the machinery which can then be operated by higher skilled, better paid people? So it's about increasing productivity so that you can increase wages.
Well, speaking at the conference this morning, MP Miriam Cates warned the falling birth rate in the UK poses the biggest threat to British conservatism and Western society. In the 1960s, British women had an average of 2.6 children each. It's now less than 1.6. The MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge says there'll be no future if we don't reverse this trend.
Even without further fall in just 2 generations' time, there will be 40% fewer births than there are today. That is population collapse. You cannot be socially liberal and economically conservative. If you think that government and society should have nothing to say about the conditions that promote strong families, do not be surprised when you end up with a high-tax, high-spend economy, with a nation of broken people dependent on the state.
A ballot on industrial action by senior doctors in England opens today. The British Medical Association says talks with the government to try and resolve the long-running pay dispute remain deadlocked. The union claims the average doctor's salary has dropped by 35% over the past decade, even before inflation is considered. The Health Department says consultants were given a 4.5% pay rise last year and is urging them to carefully consider the effect of further strikes on patients. The ballot will close at the end of June. Meanwhile, 2 teacher unions have opened new ballots on further strike action. It's after members of the National Association of Head Teachers and the National Education Union rejected the latest pay offer from the government. Voting will close at the end of July, with potential strike action to take place in the autumn term. The Royal College of Nursing has revealed nurses fear being taken to court over the level of care they give to patients. The union says more than 9 out of 10 nurses raise concerns that patients may be receiving unsafe care due to their working conditions. Some nurses have described feeling suicidal as they deem corridor treatment degrading for patients. Turkey's presidential election appears to be heading for a runoff, with the 2 candidates unlikely to clear the 50% threshold needed to avoid a second round. With almost all of the ballot boxes counted, President Erdogan led with 49% of votes, and his rival, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, had 44%. If both candidates do not pass the threshold, there'll be a second round on the 28th of May. Journalist Ali Mustafa told us he thinks Erdogan has no rival. This is GB News. More from me shortly. Now, though, it's back to Mark.
Tamsin, thanks very much indeed. So, the UK seemingly deepening its commitment in the fight against Russia. Ukrainian pilots now to be trained in the UK until they're combat ready. Well, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announcing the move after meeting Vladimir Zelenskyy at his countryside residence, Chequers, this morning. The UK still not providing any actual jets, though, at the moment. The Prime Minister said, though, that the UK was steadfast, warning Russia, we are not going away. And yet again, it was hugs and smiles, and my friend Rishi and the Prime Minister likening President Zelensky to Winston Churchill. Our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, can join us now in the studio once more. And certainly the body language, as well as the language itself, was there. But just to look at the hardware, if you like, we understand more drones, more anti-aircraft missiles, training pilots, but still no jets.
No jets, but when you look at what the UK has done to date, and this is why, you know, we see Volodymyr Zelensky describing Rishi Sunak as a friend. Britain's the biggest contributor militarily to Ukraine outside of the United States, though Germany, of course, announced a massive package over the weekend. This is part of a wider deal. As President Zelensky arrived at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence today, part of that wider kind of almost sales pitch to European leaders today. He's been, over the weekend, he was in Germany, France and the Vatican, now in the UK today, though he has just left in the last hour or so, heading back, we think, to Kyiv. In terms of the military hardware itself, what's fascinating about this, so far the UK has provided tanks, it's provided air defence missiles, it's provided army vehicles, it's provided helicopters. What's a kind of slight game changer about kind of the recent changes and the ramping up, where the UK has gone further pretty much than anyone else, is these long-range missiles. Moscow today saying they've already shot one of them down.
This is the cruise missile.
These are the Storm Shadow missiles. 155 miles they can travel. And that's the concern, is that they can then strike these logistic hubs, the supply lines for the Russians, and thus in doing so becomes a more potent force than simply just acting purely defensively. You almost kind of actually
take the fight to them.
You take the fight to them. And that is why I think we've heard from the Kremlin today, essentially saying that they are, I think, deeply disappointed and had an extremely negative view of Britain supplying these weapons to Ukraine. On the jets, much talk about these training of pilots. No sense the UK is going to actually offer jets anytime soon, though the Prime Minister has repeatedly refused to rule that out.
Now, we remember you were there, of course, in Westminster Hall when President Zelensky asked about the typhoons, and despite the very warm welcome, still no word. I gather there's just a bit of word coming in from Number 10, the Prime Minister's spokesman saying no plans to supply fighter jets. The Ukrainians made a decision to train their pilots on F-16s, American jets, and you know the RAF don't use those. While the UK would not provide that specific capability, the UK would be working with other countries who are looking to provide F-16s. So a bit of a clue there as to which direction they're taking.
And let's be clear about that. I mean, that is countries, some of them in Eastern Europe, places like Poland, for example.
NATO supplied.
The most notable, of course, the United States, who make them.
Yeah, but it's interesting, we've got Tobias Ellwood, who's gone public, the chair of the Select Defence Committee, saying, look, we can't empty our cupboards, keep supplying Ukraine with all this hardware. I mean, is there a growing sense behind the scenes that, you know, we can do this for a limited time, but we've really got to start thinking about shutting up shop at some stage? And, of course, does that echo what's happening in Washington?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, the United States has provided some £30 billion worth. I think we've provided around 3 to 4 billion, I think, over the last 15 months or so. You know, those are notable figures by any stretch of the imagination. Germany was 3 billion, over the weekend in terms of their contribution. This war began, if you remember, Mark, 8-9 years ago.
Yeah.
We've been supplying weapons and training Ukrainian troops, not just since the start of February last year, but actually way beyond that. And it will get to a point, because there is no sense. Ben Wallace has already said this war's not going to end this year. It may not end next year. It may not end the year after that. I mean, this could be a very, very long war of attrition indeed. And in that sense, you know, then it becomes the kind of game of, well, you know, who is going to run out of weapons first? I mean, Moscow's clearly had some strain. We saw that at the Midday parade.
With a single Tu-34 tank
in Moscow last week.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Ukraine is going through a lot of ammunition, it's going through a lot of weapons, it's going through a lot of... I mean, we heard from that US intelligence report that there were concerns that essentially its air defences were already on its knees. So in that essence, yes, there is a realistic question for NATO, for the UK and others, about just how much more money they continue supply. And that's two basic fronts. It's i.e. literally having the equipment itself. And also concerns about public support. You know, there will be public support still, I would argue, is still very, very high in this country. But what you tend to find is the longer these things go on, the more that drains away.
And, of course, we've got a presidential race in the United States coming up as well with what the Republicans may decide. Darren, as ever, thank you for that. But let's now speak to Keir Giles, expert in Russian power projection at the Foreign Affairs think tank Chatham House. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Keir. I'm just looking at what we heard from President Zelensky there at Chequers, saying, very important counter-offensive steps. We need some more time, but not much. I mean, does that give us a clue as to why, again, there's been this suggestion of more drones and more anti-aircraft missiles and so on? There may be something fairly shortly.
There may be, but again, as you heard from your correspondent earlier, and Darren McCaffrey, we've been expecting this for a long time. But the brakes have been put on it by the reluctance of the Ukraine's Western partners to actually supply what Ukraine's identified as being needed for the counteroffensive. And every time we come up against a conversation about a new type of weapon system that is essential for Ukraine, we go through the same process. Now it is combat aircraft, fighter jets. There's been F-16s used as a shorthand for everything that Ukraine needs to ensure that it has control of the sky for this counteroffensive. Previously, it was main battle tanks. Before that, it was long-range artillery. Every single time, there's the reluctance that Zelensky has to overcome. And that's part of the reason for this tour that he's doing at the moment. Finding that balance between expressing gratitude for the support that Ukraine has received, but at the same time pointing out that they have not got enough to liberate their occupied territories and to continue defending Europe against Russia.
Is there also this balancing act that both Zelensky and all the other Western leaders have to achieve, and that is enough defensive capability, but without indicating to Russia that it might become offensive and go over its border, particularly with aircraft, and therefore escalate?
That's been one of the key reasons why, for example, the United States has been supporting Ukraine with one foot on the brake consistently, because they are petrified of offending Russia. They have internalized all of the Russian propaganda about how if you upset Russia too much, there will be a nuclear strike. It is complete nonsense, and yet it is holding back all of the support that Ukraine actually needs. It's also holding back what Ukraine is allowed to do with the weapons it does receive. It's protecting Russia from the consequences of Russia's own war by saying that Ukraine is not allowed to strike into Russia itself. So Ukraine is still fighting with one hand tied behind its back while it's facing this genocidal war of total extermination that Russia wants to inflict on the country.
Yeah, we've got some reaction from the Kremlin today saying it takes an extremely negative view of Britain supplying Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine. Well, they might. But what is Putin's game here? Does he really just try and wait this out and hope that this Western sort of approach starts to fracture or fatigue in some way?
Oh, yes, the Kremlin says it takes an extremely negative view of what the UK is supplying to Ukraine. Well, good. There wouldn't be much point in doing it if it didn't upset the Kremlin by providing these war-winning capabilities. But at the same time, yes, if you're looking at this from Russia and looking at the reluctance and the hesitancy that they're seeing from this Western coalition, they might well conclude that they can wait out Europe and they can exhaust Ukraine through attrition and simply by throwing in more bodies, more antiquated equipment to soak up Ukrainian bullets and shell.
And when do we think that there will be a spring offensive, or I think we actually just lost the line there, which is rather a shame. But anyway, we're just about to ask when we might think we'll see this spring offensive, but clearly that might... I think we have regained... yes, we got you back. Sorry about that. We had an interruption on the signal. Finally, just to say, will we see a spring offensive, or is this just going to be a small push here and there rather than a big battle?
It's already late to call it a spring offensive. It could have been a spring offensive if everything that Ukraine needed to carry it out was provided and in a prompt manner and at the time when Ukraine actually explained in advance that these capabilities would be required. Instead, the brakes have been on, so we're now moving well into the summer, and still President Zelensky says all the ingredients necessary for a successful offensive are not yet in place.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and of course we'll... keep people updated on that. Thank you very much indeed. But let's just bring you a bit more response that we're getting coming in from number 10. And this is from a Downing Street spokesman who's saying the Prime Minister welcomed Ukrainian President Zelensky, thanked the Prime Minister for the enduring support of the British people for the people of Ukraine. The Prime Minister outlined the new package of support the UK has announced today, including further air defence missiles and drones. This builds on the confirmation last week that the UK has become the first country to provide long-range cruise missiles to Ukraine. So that's just come in from number 10, just giving official confirmation of what was discussed there at Chequers. More reaction, of course, as it comes in. Also coming up, reaction to Keir Starmer's plans to extend voting rights to EU nationals, yes, to vote in the general election even if they're not a British citizen. The Tory party said he's trying to rig future elections, but the Labour leader says it's common sense to allow them into the ballot box. More reaction to that in a moment.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nah, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching. Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, Sir Keir Starmer has indicated it is common sense, that's the phrase he's used, to allow EU nationals who've worked for years in the UK, got settled status as it's called, to vote in a general election. Labour considering extending the franchise. Well, under manifesto plans, he said there will be a package of proposals to include handing votes to 16 and 17-year-olds too. But the Tories are reacted by accusing Labour of trying to rig future elections by handing votes to those more likely to vote for the party. Let's speak now to our Deputy Political Editor, Tom Harwood. And Tom, it begs the question, when is a policy not a policy? Because they now, or have sort of taken time to stress that these are currently things being looked at rather than sort of official policy.
This policy document that was leaked over the weekend contains a number of policies that might go into the Labour manifesto. The Labour Party saying, of course, they have not yet written their manifesto, and that's perfectly true, but these are certainly policies under active discussion. And it's a pretty strong hint in terms of where the Labour Party is thinking. And these two proposals to do with lowering the franchise and extending it to non-citizens as well have caused some controversy, because really looking at these issues in the round, people are raising an eyebrow in terms of the groups that are being discussed, given the vote, are groups that are generally cephalogically agreed to more likely lean to the Labour Party.
And certainly he's talked about someone in this interview who's been here 10, 20, 30 years contributing to the economy, part of our community, ought to be able to vote. However, at the moment, basically, you've got to be a citizen as such to have that right. They're talking about having a vote without having full British citizenship.
Yes.
So that's where really people are getting a bit confused about it.
Right. Now, it must be stated first off, there are some non-citizens who can vote. Irish citizens, for example, because of the particular historical relationship between the United Kingdom and Ireland. Indeed, Commonwealth citizens in some circumstances as well. The difference here is people with settled status who are not British citizens, who have leave to remain in the United Kingdom. They currently can't vote for members of Parliament in general elections. In recent years, they have been able to vote in Scottish devolved elections and in Welsh devolved elections. The Labour Party policy would be allowing that group to vote in general elections as well. But it does raise the question, because, of course, migrants can vote in general elections if they choose to become citizens.
Yes.
It raises the question, why wouldn't a group of people decide to become citizens if they so want the vote?
Yeah, and if they've been here 10, 15, 20 years, well. And equally, you could have someone who is technically a French or Italian or Spanish citizen voting here in a UK election. We could not vote in an Italian, Spanish or French election in terms of reciprocal agreement, if you like.
No, we couldn't, unless we decided to get citizenship in those countries, or join the European Union, God forbid. But the argument in favour of this is that there are 16 countries around the world that forbid dual citizenship being held.
Right.
Very few of them are in Europe, it must be said. Poland is the one that is the striking example, but there are lots of other little countries around the world that forbid dual citizenship. And it could be argued that it's then unfair if someone moves to this country, wants to retain their original citizenship.
Become disenfranchised as a result.
Perhaps, and the argument is no taxation without representation. However, if someone's been living here for 30 years, you'd think they might rather become a British citizen. So it does raise that question.
Now, the other issue is voting age going down to 16 or 17, which is a favourite of the old British Constitution A-level papers, I seem to remember. Sakir's saying it's not such an outlandish idea, but it's certainly raised a lot of debate and comment over the years, hasn't it? Because obviously, you may be old enough to smoke a cigarette, have a drink, but not old enough to do other things, for instance.
Well, interestingly, the age at which we achieve certain rights have been moving in precisely the opposite direction in recent years. It was only in February this year that child marriage became illegal in this country. People who are 16 and 17-year-old used to be able to get married. Now they're not able to get married, even with parental consent. There was some concern about exploitation around younger groups of people. Similarly, with regards to fighting for your country in the army, that is now illegal under the UN Convention on Child Soldiers. So there are all sorts of areas where children, and particularly with regard to the advertising of sugary drinks, the ability to buy cigarettes or alcohol, all of these things, of course, forbidden for 16 and 17-year-olds. And in some cases, the argument of people on the left is to increase the drinking age or increase the smoking age to 21, to 25, to the early 30s. We've seen this discussion over driving licence, not being able to have a driving licence until you're 25 in a full-fledged way.
Giving them the power to be able to vote on a government government that will be introducing such measures.
It does seem that there is a remarkable inconsistency, particularly the group of people saying that you shouldn't be able to do all sorts of things until you're much, much older, are now saying that voting is the exception to that rule. And that does raise a few eyebrows in terms of what's the motivation here? Is it that they really believe a 16-year-old is an adult, or is it that they think there might be some votes in it?
Because the younger are slightly more left-leaning. Oh, well, yeah, another British Constitution A-level question. Tom, as ever, thank you very much indeed. Let's move on now to industrial relations, which has been dogging the government, of course, for many months. Well, members of the National Association of Head Teachers now and National Education Union, after rejecting the latest pay offers, have called to vote on industrial action. The ballot's going out. Not alone either, after a deadlock of talks with the government. Senior doctors, consultants now voting today to decide whether or not to strike in their continuing dispute over paying conditions in their health service. Let's catch up with Catherine once more on the latest developments. And, of course, we should add, Catherine, that down in Brighton, the RCN, the nurses meeting as well to decide their way forward. It seems as if this is still dogging the government in terms of moving on in industrial strategy.
Yes, indeed. It's not very long since the 5% offer that the RCN initially advised its members to accept. The government hoped that would be a sort of template to resolve these disputes with the public sector, but that has not proved to be the case. So Pat Cullen now is calling for a double-digit increase. Nurses are likely to be reballoted again shortly, though that deal was rejected by only 54% on a fairly low turnout. And of course, lots of other health unions did accept that deal. But today, junior doctors, we know the dispute is ongoing, and now senior doctors too, consultants now balloting for potential strike action. They're saying that their pay is down 35% since 2010. They're saying they are effectively working for 4 months of the year for free. Of course, they are paid, as the government points out, an average of £128,000 a year. The government also keen to stress that the £1 million tax pension pot that was tax-free, they've lifted the cap on that. They're very keen to get doctors staying in the NHS and back too. And then, of course, we also have the teachers. If you've got a child at state school in England, you'll know all about this, because kids have now lost about a week's education, and it looks very likely that come the autumn, there may be coordinated strikes with the National Education Union, the National Association of Head Teachers. The NEU rejected the government's offer by 98% on a 2/3 turnout. So really, really digging in, and the winter of discontent going on into the summer and potentially an autumn and, heavens forbid, another winter.
And just to touch on the health unions in particular, I mean, I know that the consultants are talking about a 35% pay claim, echoing, of course, those very high figures that the nurses had originally. And we've now got the RCN going back and saying, no, we want double digit. But, I mean, not the 19% that perhaps they were originally talking about. Pat Cullen perhaps talking about just pushing it over from the 9% consolidated for 2 years to maybe 10%, and that could get a deal done.
Yes, potentially, but the government are holding very firm on this. And of course, most of the health unions, the physiotherapists, the midwives, Unison and GMB, all accepted that pay offer. It was only Unite and the Royal College of Nursing that held out against it. And of course, Pat Cullen's on a bit of a sticky wicket, isn't she? Because she recommended her members to accept that deal. She said at the time that she felt it was the maximum they were going to get. So now she's had to do a complete about turn and say this is simply not enough. And now, of course, the nurses had huge support from the public, but whether that will start to fray, I think that's up for debate.
Catherine, thanks for updating us there at Westminster. And, of course, we'll see what these ballots emerge with in the coming weeks. Thank you very much indeed. Also coming up here on GB News Live, Suella Braverman due to speak at a fringe conference this afternoon, joining perhaps other voices critical of government policy. Could the Prime Minister be in trouble? Discussing that in a moment. First, latest headlines now with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you. Here are the headlines at 1:31. The UK is to start training Ukrainian pilots to fly Western fighter jets in the near future. The Prime Minister has...
One thing we will be doing, starting actually relatively soon, is training of Ukrainian pilots, and that's something that we've discussed today. We're ready to implement those plans in relatively short order, which will mean that we're training Ukrainian citizens to become absolutely combat-ready aircraft pilots.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak there speaking after his meeting with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy this morning. The Home Secretary will urge the government to stick to its manifesto pledge of reducing overall migration. In a speech at the National Conservatism Conference later, Suella Braverman will argue the UK should train its own workforce of lorry drivers and fruit pickers and be less dependent on low-skilled foreign labour. That's ahead of official figures, which are expected to show net migration at a record high of between 650,000 and 1 million people within the last year. A ballot on industrial action by senior doctors in England opened today. The British Medical Association says talks with the government to try and resolve the long-running pay dispute remain deadlocked. The Health Department says consultants were given a 4.5% pay rise last year and is urging them to carefully consider the effect of further strikes on patients. Meanwhile, 2 teacher unions have opened new ballots on further strike action. It's after members of the National Association of Head Teachers and the National Education Union rejected the latest pay offer from the government. Voting will close at the end of July, with potential strike action to take place in the autumn term. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends were like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison? I don't believe in prisons. I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton Tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, in a speech later today, the Home Secretary expected to warn that Britain has become too dependent on foreign labour, warning that Britain must not forget how to do things for ourselves, calling, for instance, for homegrown fruit pickers and HGV drivers. Well, there has been some speculation of increasing party divisions over migration and immigration, some members more keen than others to stress the benefits of economic growth and migration. Indeed, this morning, Trade Minister Nigel Huddleston insisting that higher numbers of low-skilled workers were often, quote, a good thing, as new net migration figures are predicted to hit a record level of close to 1 million. That figure expected later this month. Well, joining us now, political reporter Olivia Utley, who is at this Conservative conference today. Olivia, it's the second in as many days we should say, at the right of the party, I guess, that has been criticising some government policies, particularly economic policies.
Yes, absolutely. When Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister at the end of last September, there was a general feeling across the whole party that making any fuss about his leadership would lead to basically extinction of the party. People were so worried in the Conservative Party that after all the turbulence of last summer, the Tories just didn't have another chance to have any sort of infighting going on. So the Tory party held together. There was a fragile kind of unity. And I think now, particularly after the local elections a couple of weeks ago, where the Tories fared very, very badly, that fragile unity is beginning to fall apart. So we had the sort of Bring Back Boris conference in Bournemouth over the weekend, where there was a lot of criticism of Rishi Sunak's leadership. And this morning at NatCon, where I am now, there's been some really quite explicit criticism of the Prime Minister. We had Miriam Cates, who's a rising star in the Tory party, criticise Jeremy Hunt's childcare policy, saying that it was anti-conservative and anti-mother. We had Jacob Rees-Mogg saying that the government's plan to only sunset 400 of the 6,000 EU laws was pathetically unambitious. That is very stark words indeed. And as you say, this afternoon we're expecting to hear Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, stand up and say that she thinks that mass migration has gone too far and needs to be brought down. Now, has Rishi Sunak given her the authority to say that, or is she talking, as it were, off-piece? It'll be really interesting to see how the Prime Minister responds. This evening, the Prime Minister, not letting any of this get to him, it seems, is hosting all Conservative MPs at a Downing Street reception. So his motto seems to be sort of to rise above the fray. But the rumblings of discontent that we've been hearing for the last sort of 6 months ago are definitely beginning to bubble over the surface.
Yeah, we understand that he's going to be offering pies from his North Yorkshire constituency at this get-together. So not perhaps pork barrel politics, but pork pie politics, some may say.
Absolutely, giant pork pies from his constituency. Will that be enough to placate some of these MPs who really do seem quite dissatisfied with the Tory party leadership? Well, we'll wait and see.
OK, we'll let you go and speak to see if it's going to swing the vote for him amongst those people at that particular conference. But we can't wait to see how big the pie is to stretch across the entire party, of course. Thank you very much indeed. Well, staying with governmental matters, Business and Trade Secretary Kira Rudik in Switzerland today for talks to modernise the UK's trade agreement, post-Brexit trade agreement, that is, with Switzerland. She'll be meeting her Swiss counterpart, the Federal Councillor Guy Parmelin. Rudik saying that the UK and Switzerland are natural trading partners. Well, what they're going to be trading? Let's bring in Liam with On the Money to find out. Cuckoo clocks and chocolate, was that a bit unkind?
The third man, Carol Reid, showing our age.
Yeah.
So look,
Black
Mark,
and white.
You don't need a trade deal to trade with other countries, OK? But if we don't have a trade deal with America, nor does the European Union, but America's still 17% of our trade. It's just if you do have a trade deal, there are likely to be much, much lower tariffs and quotas, so fewer restrictions on trade that domestic politicians put on to protect their companies from foreign competition. So that's a very key idea in understanding all this. Now, since we left the European Union, the UK now negotiates its own trade deals. Before, the European Union negotiated our trade deals for us, which meant our trade deals had to reflect what France, Germany and all the rest of it wanted, not just...
One size fits all.
Not just what we wanted. And frankly, in those negotiations, what the UK wanted would often get trounced by what France and Germany wanted, because we're a much more of a service-oriented economy. We're exporting finance and legal and insurance rather than so many manufactured goods. And since we left the European Union, finally, in late 2019, early 2020, we have cut quite a few trade deals. And here are some of them here. I've just listed them for you. So in October 2020, we cut a trade deal with Japan, the world's third biggest economy. Then we cut that free trade agreement with the European Union in December 2020, the Aussies in June 21, New Zealand in February 2022. In March 2023, this is the big one, the CPTPP, that's the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. What does that mean? It means a massive trade deal with 11 Pacific Rim countries, countries around the Pacific, Canada, Mexico, Japan again, and many, many others. So in all, we've got trade deals with 71 countries. Some of those are similar to the deals we had under the EU, but a lot of them are deals that we've renegotiated so they suit the UK.
Yeah, the critics, of course, say that Pacific deal, adding just 1.8 billion a year to the economy after 10 years, which they have worked out is less than 1% of GDP. So they're saying, yeah, it's, you know, a deal, but it's not fantastic.
So that was the department's number, the Business and Trade Department, before Kemi Badenoch was Secretary of State. And she told me in an exclusive interview that that number was, quotes, ridiculous because it doesn't understand, it uses modelling that thinks that you trade more with countries that are near to you, which isn't actually the case. You know, we trade a lot more with UAE than we do with Sweden, even though UAE is in the Middle East. Why? Because a lot of what we trade, we squirt down computers, we email our stuff. And it's similar with Switzerland, right? Switzerland isn't near as France, but Switzerland is a massive trading partner of the UK. And here are some quick numbers, Mark. So Switzerland is already the UK's 10th biggest trading partner. Switzerland is a small country, cuckoo clocks and all the rest of it. It's a top 20 global economy. It's a major, major place. We do £53 billion worth of trade with the Swiss because we're both big services economies, financially sophisticated. But our existing trade deal, Mark, doesn't even include services, because it dates from 1970.
Before the internet.
Before the internet, but also the trade deals that existed when we were in the European Union, they tend to be focused on manufacturing. They almost don't include services, which is why they never made any sense for us, because 80% of our economy is services.
Now, I think they're estimating this could reduce duties for British businesses by about 7.4 million in terms of lower tariffs. But is there a question mark about Switzerland's economic position? And, you know, we wouldn't have been asking that years ago. But bearing in mind what's happened with the banking sector, there have been questions about how robust things are there.
Yes, Switzerland is obviously a major financial services centre, got a very prominent banking system, and there are problems with banks all across the world at the moment. And it would be weird if a major interlinked globalised economy like Switzerland didn't also have some issues involved. Look, there will be lots of more trade between the UK and Switzerland, I think, not just financial services, but chemicals as well, medical services, medical goods, things that we manufacture for the medical sector and vice versa. So Kemi Badenoch's gone to Bern, the capital of Switzerland, of course, today. This isn't the beginning of the negotiation. It's kind of the pre-negotiation.
Right.
I've been in touch with her. She says the atmosphere there is good. But these trade deals take time. But I would reiterate by finishing with what I started with. You don't actually need trade deals to trade. We will carry on trading with Switzerland. We'll carry on trading with countries where we don't have trade deals. But if you have new, up-to-date trade deals, that makes trade much, much better. And Britain is a major trading nation. It's where we get a lot of our wealth from that pays the taxes, that pays for everything else.
as well as the chocolate and cuckoo clocks. Never forget those. Thank you very much indeed for taking us through that. And, of course, we'll update people on this particular trade visit by the Trade Minister, the Trade Secretary. Now, let's talk about what's been happening in Turkey, because its relationship with the West hanging in the balance after last night's election vote, leading to a runoff probably or possibly this month. Neither candidate securing an outright majority. Still a bit of counting going on. But the vote will, of course, decide Turkey's direction internationally and perhaps a stronger relationship with NATO and the EU if President Erdogan is defeated. Well, let's speak to our national reporter, Paul Hawkins, now, who joins us live from Enfield. It's got the largest Turkish-speaking community in the country. Because the other aspect, Paul, of course, the election seems to be divided very much on secular and religious lines, and it's not just about the politics, it's about the social makeup of the voters as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely part of it. I'll tell you what's interesting. We did go to Enfield earlier. We're actually in Haringey at the moment, still part of that big Turkish diaspora in North London. We have spoken to so many people this morning, and no one wanted to go on camera and talk to us because essentially they say they don't want their families to become targets of the government. They say that they're worried about Erdogan, and indeed that's what his critics say, that he's kind of ruled Turkey with an iron fist. He's clamped down on opposition, on criticism. Journalists have been locked up, etc. One lady we spoke to here said that she was happy to give her opinion on him and that he's been bad for the economy, he's been ultra religious, and that Turkey is a secular country. And then she said that one of her friends in Germany posted something on Instagram, and then the next time she flew to Turkey, she was arrested upon her arrival because of her post. And another member of her family said that a similar thing happened to another friend of hers. So people here are scared to talk, but generally speaking, most people here have decided to vote for the opposition candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. They've also been watching the results closely. It is a close-run thing, but we think that after 98% of the votes counted, it is going to go to a second runoff in 2 weeks' time. And the interesting thing will be to see whether a third-place candidate, a guy called Sinan Ogan, he's an ultra-nationalist, he polled 5% of the vote. Where that 5% of the vote is going to go? Is it going to go to the opposition candidate who picked up 45%, or is it going to go to President Erdogan, who's been in power for 20 years? He picked up 49% of the vote. The two big issues in the election that will continue to resonate with voters: inflation, official figure 44% in Turkey. They think it's running closer to 100% because President Erdogan has refused to cut interest rates, unlike here in the UK, where, as elsewhere around the world, interest rates have been rising. The other big issue as well, President Erdogan's response to the earthquake. He was slow to respond, say his critics, and also the building regulations that he put in place weren't followed. It is going to be difficult, though. He does have a tight grip on the media in Turkey. And it is going to be difficult for the opposition, and they're going to be trying to pick up the 5% vote. One thing to note as well, there were parliamentary elections, and President Erdogan's AKP party it looks like they have retained control of parliament. So even if there's an opposition candidate who's running the presidency, it is going to be harder for him to get what he wants done, given that President Erdogan's party will still be running the parliament.
And, of course, just to reflect that the last time we spoke to that community there in North London, they were, as you say, very critical of the response to the earthquake. Many families having lost loved ones, of course, as a result of all that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the big issues, inflation and the cost of living in Turkey, which is considerably higher than it is in the UK. And then the other one, as you say, is the earthquake, both how he responded to it and why it happened. Now, he says that in his defence, it's a natural disaster. There's nothing I could do about it. We were doing our best. The official government estimate is that 50,000 people died in that earthquake. It's thought to be at least twice that, and there are still people buried under the rubble in many parts of Turkey, and that has helped to amplify that level of criticism against President Erdogan. But it is going to be fascinating to see how Turkey goes when it goes to the runoff reacts when it goes to the runoff in 2 weeks' time, and a very tense time for Turkey as well, because if Erdogan wins, the opposition will say it was a rigged election. If he doesn't win, well, there could still be a reaction. So either way, it's going to be a very tense time in Istanbul, and as you say, really important for us in the UK and the rest of the West, because essentially you're looking at Erdogan very much in the Viktor Orban, Donald Trump nationalist mould, who's been a friend of Vladimir Putin. He's been had decent relations with China, and he's also been quite a critic of his fellow NATO members. In fact, he's blocked Sweden's membership of NATO. So very much the West will be hoping that Brilliant. They'll be hoping that the opposition candidate does come through. The West will be. But in the meantime, a lot of other people, including Vladimir Putin, will be hoping that Erdogan continues in power.
Paul, and your political commentator there, thank you very much indeed for updating us in North London. Thank you. Now, we've seen driverless cars, driverless trains. Now, a driverless bus service starting today between Fife and Edinburgh Park train station in Scotland. A 14-mile route served by 5 single-decker autonomous buses, as they're called. Let's get more with our Scotland reporter, Tony Maguire, who's been following that journey. And, Tony, one might scratch your head a little bit because driverless bus that has actually got a driver in the cab and even a captain on board as well. Explain.
Yes, so as you say, a driverless bus, still a man or a woman in the hot seat. You got a question, I mean, that sounds like quite a good gig if you ask me. This is a 30-minute route for these 5 stagecoach buses. AB1 is the new route put in place just for these buses. And the driver sits at the ready to grab the wheel. So as you said, I'm sure he's got a few levels of Candy Crush to crack on with between Edinburgh and Fife. And certainly behind me as well, lots of stagecoach staff, as well as some people doing a survey from Napier University. They were involved quite heavily in the research. But the most interesting kind of research that I've done today is to actually speak to some of the passengers who made the trip here today. Many of them made return journeys and more than once. Let's hear what they had to say. Tell me about your experience on the bus today.
It was excellent. Yeah, I was quite confident. I wasn't worried at all. Lots of reassurance. And if anything, I probably expected it, and it was safer than it would be with just a normal driver, because I knew they'd be taking loads of safety precautions, so I wasn't worried at all.
Because at the moment you've got the 2 members of staff on board rather than just the 1 driver. So clearly that's not sustainable, but we'll wait and see how it goes.
When was the last time you rode a bus with a bus conductor on it?
Oh, it's probably still in short trousers.
The thing goes beep, and I think they call it the captain, the guy on board who's just looking after the passengers, says we're now in autonomous mode, and you just go, oh, this is great fun, you know, burling along, controlled by a machine rather than a human being. But you know, you've got the driver there with his hands on the wheel just in case.
The captain and the driver are very friendly, kept us up to date with the journey, told us at which points the bus was driving on its own, and I definitely one of the most interesting bus journeys I've done in a long time.
Now, what I would say is that those guys there, they described the role of the captain much better than I do. They're just there to answer questions and to kind of make sure everyone's safe. This is very much still a trial. This is phase 1 of the Cav Forth experiment. In phase 2, we're going to see an extension of the line all the way up to Dunfermline. Stage 3, we'll see some more electric buses roll in and actually kind of go further towards the 2045 target. And then stage 4 eventually, well, you wouldn't be asking me that question then, Mark, because there won't be any drivers. In fact, there'll be no personnel in the bus. Fully autonomous buses for the journey.
OK, the start of a long journey for the driverless bus, but certainly got off to a successful start there. Tony, thank you for updating us and taking us on board as well. Coming up here on GB News Live, we'll be updating you on what has been happening at Chequers. My friend Rishi, as President Zelensky called the Prime Minister, as we are promising more arms and help for Ukraine, but still no jets. Also coming up, has Sunak lost support in his own party? Discussing that in a moment. Stay with us.
Alex Deacon here with your latest weather from the Met Office for GB News. A fine bright day for most today with sunny spells, but it's not particularly warm out there, and there are a few heavy showers around across parts of Scotland and eastern England. We have this weather front moving across the country last night. High pressure is toppling in behind, bringing plenty of fine weather, certainly to the west. But as I said, there are a few showers around. We've seen some across Scotland and a few more breaking out now across parts of eastern England. Could be 1 or 2 heavy ones, possibly even a rumble of thunder. But much of Wales, the Midlands, southwest England, Northern Ireland and the west coast of Scotland staying dry and bright. And even in the east, you could easily dodge the showers and have a bit of sunshine. But It's not warm. We might squeak up to 19 degrees, but generally temperatures only in the mid-teens and feeling cooler when the showers come along. And there'll still be a few of those showers around this evening over parts of northeast England especially, but they do fade away by midnight, and then most places become dry and clear before more cloud spills into northern Scotland later on. Quite a chilly night, actually. Temperatures well down into single figures. Pockets of frost can't be completely ruled out in some sheltered parts of the countryside. So a fresh start to Tuesday for sure, but generally a fine day for England and Wales. Cloud coming into northern Scotland. It's quite a grey day here with some patchy rain trickling down towards the central belt and southern Scotland later on. Perhaps clouding over a touch in Northern Ireland, but the far north may actually brighten up. The wind's coming down from the north, so still a bit of a chilly feel. Temperatures again generally around or a touch below average. Highest probably in the south, 18 or 19 Celsius. It stays fine across the south during Tuesday evening. 1 or 2 showers still across southern Scotland and northern England at this stage. But the high pressure we saw earlier is generally in control through much of this week. So bar the odd shower here and there, much of the week will be dry and bright. And slowly it will start to feel just a little bit warmer as well. Goodbye.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I have walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
It's 2 o'clock. A very good afternoon to you. You're with GB News Live. I'm Mark Longhurst. And coming up for you this Monday afternoon, my friend Rishi Zelenskyy gives Sunak a big hug as the Prime Minister compares the Ukrainian leader to Winston Churchill. The UK now to train Ukrainian pilots to be combat ready, but still not providing any jets. And is the Prime Minister running out of friends in his own party? In a second Tory fringe conference in as many days, Suella Braverman to criticise her own government's performance on migration. Jacob Rees-Mogg describes Jeremy Hunt's budget as more like a Labour model. But Sir Keir Starmer also in trouble after saying he may allow millions of settled EU migrants to join 16 and 17-year-olds in getting the vote under a Labour government. The Tories accuse him of planning to rig future elections. And hold tight, please, as we take you on a ride aboard Scotland's new driverless buses. But just why do they still need a captain on board to be safe? First, though, an update on the latest news headlines with Tamsin. That's just coming up for you now.
Mark, thank you. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom. It's 2:01. The UK is to start training Ukrainian pilots to fly Western fighter jets in the summer, but has no plans to provide them with planes. The Prime Minister has met Ukrainian President Zelenskyy at Chequers and said that providing warplanes wasn't straightforward at the moment. Starting this summer, however, Ukrainian pilots could train in skills that they could adapt to flying non-Western fighter planes. The Prime Minister has compared President Zelenskyy's wartime leadership to that of Winston Churchill. The meeting comes as the UK is pledged to send hundreds of new long-range attack drones to Ukraine.
One thing we will be doing, starting actually relatively soon, is training of Ukrainian pilots, and that's something that we've discussed today. We're ready to implement those plans in relatively short order, which will mean that we're training Ukrainian citizens to become absolutely combat-ready aircraft pilots.
President Zelenskyy said the fighter jets are an important issue for his country's defence.
Today we spoke about the jets, very important topic for us. Because we can't control the sky, you know it. So I think you know everything deeply, because we're real partners. Rishi knows all the details, what's going on our battlefield. Thank you very much. And we want to create this jets coalition, and I'm very positive with it.
The Home Secretary will urge the government to stick to its manifesto pledge of reducing overall migration. In a speech shortly, Suella Braverman will argue the UK should train its own workforce of lorry drivers and fruit pickers and be less dependent on low-skilled foreign labour. That's ahead of official figures released later this month, which are expected to show net migration at a record high of between 650,000 and 1 million people over the past year. Former Cabinet Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg told us the UK needs more automation to be more productive.
By relying on low-skilled migration over the last 30 years, we have seen very low increases in productivity. And part of the reason for that, I wouldn't say the whole reason, but part of the reason for that is we haven't mechanised as we should have done. So fruit picking remains an extremely labour-intensive operation. And not all fruits can be picked mechanically, but some can. And why haven't we been investing in the machinery which can then be operated by higher skilled, better paid people? So it's about increasing productivity so that you can increase wages.
A ballot on industrial action by senior doctors in England has opened. The British Medical Association says talks with the government to try and resolve a long-running pay dispute remain deadlocked. The union claims the average doctor's salary has dropped by 35% over the past decade, even before inflation's considered. The Health Department says consultants were given a 4.5% pay rise last year and is urging them to carefully consider the effect of further strikes on patients. The ballot will close at the end of June. Meanwhile, 2 teacher unions have opened new ballots on further strike action. It's after members of the National Association of Head Teachers and the National Education Union rejected the latest pay offer from the government. Voting will close at the end of July, with potential strike action to take place in the autumn term. The Royal College of Nursing has revealed nurses fear being taken to court over the level of care they give to patients. The union says more than 9 out of 10 nurses raise concerns that patients may be receiving unsafe care due to their working conditions. Some nurses have described feeling suicidal as they deem corridor treatment degrading for patients. The average monthly rent on newly let homes across Britain was £125 higher in April than it was at the same time last year. That tallies up to an extra £1,500 more each year. According to property agent Hamptons, the average rent paid for newly let homes reached over £1,200 a month in April, that figure being a new high. This is GB News. More from me in a while. Now, though, it's back to Mark.
Tamsin, thanks very much indeed. So the UK seemingly deepening its commitment to the fight against Russia, with Ukrainian pilots to be trained in the UK until they're combat ready, said the Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak announcing the move after meeting President Zelensky at Chequers, the prime ministerial countryside residence. But the UK still not providing any actual jets, it seems. The Prime Minister going on to say that the UK was steadfast in its support, warning Russia, "We are not going away." Let's get more with our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, joining us in the studio. Interesting, of course, Zelensky, the first foreign leader that Sunak's entertained at Chequers, and my friend Rishi and first-name terms and so on. However, we're just sort of trying to pick apart what's been promised in addition to longer-range missiles and drones and so on, in terms of this air power and the pilot training. We heard the Prime Minister saying training pilots till they're combat ready. Number 10 is now saying that it's an elementary flying phase for groups of Ukrainian pilots. For skills they can apply to different kinds of aircraft, in particular the F-16s, which we don't operate, of course.
This is why it's kind of super odd. So you've got the situation where the UK seems to be saying we're going to train pilots on planes we don't have.
Yeah.
Given the fact that also they are pilots, so they already have flown.
One would have hoped they'd have had some elementary flying
I mean, if you listen to
skills,
the Ukrainians are saying we've got a whole load of Ukrainian pilots who are frustrated because they've got no planes to fly. And then you've got the UK saying, well, we're going to offer this elementary kind of fighter jet training on jets that we don't actually have. So it is all a little odd because they're suggesting that, of course, what the Ukrainians may well get from NATO, probably from the United States, maybe from the Eastern European allies like Poland, are F-16s.
Yes, because NATO operates the F-16s already.
Which we don't have, as you say. And Downing Street, after that meeting, saying that the UK would not provide that specific capability, but they were working alongside other countries. Now, we know that there's a Council of Europe meeting in Iceland a bit later on this week. There's also a G7 in Japan. Rishi Sunak will be both of those alongside world leaders.
And I think Zelensky's joining those virtually, isn't he, from Kyiv? Yeah.
He is. So I think, in essence, this is part of a long process. That fundamental, though, the basis or that the problem for the Ukrainians is that they've been here before.
Yeah.
Essentially, they had this merry dance a year ago about tanks. Do you remember? Like, who's going to supply us with tanks? We really need tanks.
And we moved first in terms of the challenges.
The UK moved first, and maybe that's what Rishi Sunak is in the end trying to kind of usher in here.
A Pied Piper approach.
Well, maybe, because in the end, of course, Germany and France and others did finally move on tanks, and we got that at the weekend when President Zelensky was not just in the UK, but also meeting the German Chancellor Scholz as well. So, in essence, what you've got here is Rishi Sunak standing shoulder to shoulder with President Zelensky, a man who's desperate to show that the UK is consistent in his support, which is really important to the Conservative Party. So Rishi Sunak needs that politically. And President Zelensky, who wants to, let's be honest about this, squeeze as much as he can out of the UK and ensure that where it goes, others will follow.
No, you say support, but it's interesting that Tobias Ellwood, who's the Defence Select Committee chair, went public this morning saying that we can't empty the cupboard, effectively, of British military hardware to keep supplying Ukraine. Now, one wonders why he said that at this stage. Is there still a feeling behind the scenes that we're getting drawn a bit too deeply into this?
Well, when you read through what we've given, Challenger tanks, Sea King rescue helicopters, armoured vehicles, including 120 patrol vehicles, air defence systems, long-range multiple launch rocket systems, anti-tank weapons.
Quite a shopping list.
Yeah, now these drones and, of course, the Storm Shadow missiles, which Russia claims it shot down one of them today. You know what? And this is from a place in which Ministry of Defence spending is not increasing as much as Army chiefs or even the Defence Secretary would like, and at a time when it's also been massively pared back over the last 10, 15 years or so through...
Hollowed out was the phrase that Ben Wallace himself used.
Through various strategic defence reviews. So, yeah, it's not surprising that not just here, but indeed in the United States and elsewhere, I think we've given $4.6 billion. The US has given around £30 billion in terms of military hardware and support over the last 50 months or so. That at a certain stage, someone's going to say, hold on a second here. Like, you know, we have to be really careful. And actually, it's a discussion that's happened in Sweden where they were going to offer, I think, some weapons. And there was a lot of opposition in the sense that they felt that they were then leaving themselves exposed.
Right, and we've got Sweden...
Because, of course, Sweden has not gone into NATO yet.
No, but they've got this meeting next month to actually decide on this.
And that's why another news story today, the election in Turkey is massive to this because it has been President Erdogan alongside
trying to block that membership.
Viktor Orbán, who's been blocking it. Finland's joined, Sweden hasn't yet. So what I'm trying to say is these discussions about just how much support and for how long and how costly and at what strain to public opinion are happening not just here in the UK, but will be happening in various other EU countries as well.
Yeah. Just on a personal level, though, I mean, both men were using first names. There was the hug, and clearly, you know, the cameras were allowed to see everything that was going on. This is a signal being sent to Putin and the Kremlin as well, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely, without a shadow of a doubt. And that's we hear time and time again, whenever the Prime Minister's asked about this, you know, that the UK support is unwavering, is a word we hear. And let's be frank about this, you know, from what I can logically see, public opinion hasn't really shifted very much. We certainly have not seen that in Parliament. I mean, it's very rare that you get an issue where the SNP, Labour, the Lib Dems and the Conservatives are frankly on the same page.
And we remember the applause, of course, in Westminster Hall when he came to speak to all the MPs.
Yeah, it was like, you know, when Rishi Sunak calls him Churchill today, there was a sense of that in Westminster Hall. I mean, here were the great and good of British society, of parliamentarians who were slightly in awe of
and
this
another
world
tipping point of European history, of course.
Well, indeed, this is the most important conflict we've had in this continent since the end of the Second World War. But also, there is political danger here, i.e., not just on the defence procurement, but this war has dragged our economy, along with others, into an inflation crisis. It's caused an energy crisis, and that could happen again this winter.
Right.
That could happen again this winter.
OK, well, let's actually speak now to our regular guest from Kyiv, a Ukrainian Member of Parliament, Kira Rudik, who can join us once more. Kira, thank you for your time here on GB News. Good to talk to you again. Just on the point that Darren was making there, is there a recognition in Ukraine that there could be a danger if this drags on too long in that European support could start to flag and become weaker?
Hello, Mark. Thank you so much for having me. Well, indeed, we understand that the window of opportunity for us to have an effective counteroffensive is really short, and it's probably limited to this year. Yeah. Next year will be very political. We'll have elections in the United States, elections in Russia, elections in Great Britain, European elections, and many national elections as well. So politicians will be very much concentrated on internal problems, and Ukraine may become like a not a top priority, which of course hurts us. And this is why we understand that whatever we can achieve in diplomatic, political negotiations right now will allow us to push forward and have a successful counteroffensive. Of course,
and interesting, I was just picking up what President Zelenskyy was saying there at Chequers, saying very important counter-offensive steps. We need some more time, but not much. And I know, obviously, no one can talk about exactly what's going to be happening in terms of the ground offensive, but it may well be that we see some action fairly shortly then.
Well, absolutely. But on the other hand, we see that the decision on 1 billion euros for ammunition that we need badly, it was just signed like 10 days ago, not later. And it will take time for it to be executed and then actually to be all the ammunition to be sent to Ukraine. So this is why we are playing with time and we are playing against time, and every single day costs us many lives of Ukrainian citizens, and it is...
just got a slight interruption there on the signal with Kyiv, Kira. We'll stay with it. Just wondering, obviously he's got this whistle-stop tour of Europe that he's done with Germany and France, but what will the Ukrainian public be making of these pictures of him at Chequers, this very historic centre for all these leaders that have been there previously, including, of course, Winston Churchill? No, I think we have lost Kira, unfortunately, who's joining us there on that line from Kyiv, just to explain. I think you are back, Kira. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got you. I was just saying, I was just wondering what the reaction was there of people in Ukraine seeing these pictures of President Zelensky at this very historic location, a location, of course, that Rishi Sunak said is where Winston Churchill made many of his speeches from.
Well, of course, it gives us hope. And we are thrilled that Britain continues to be one of our strongest allies, being a champion in making the important critical decisions for us. Because you know what we have seen recently is there should be a champion and then the rest would follow. And we are so incredibly grateful for so many decisions where Britain was our champion in providing us tanks, in making decisions on heavy weapons, in making decisions on various coalitions. Right now, we hope Britain will be a champion in making the decisions on the fighter jets, of course.
Yeah, just to ask you finally about those jets. I mean, there's some confusion as about what may be supplied and when. Certainly an undertaking that will help to train these pilots. But your understanding is that you're still holding out for F-16s rather than the British Typhoons that we can see here.
Well, we can only push for what our military are asking. And they say that F-16 is the best point that they need and that it will allow us to gain the dominance in the sky, which is essential for us for winning this war. So if our soldiers and pilots are saying F-16, we as politicians saying, OK, this is what we need to get and this is what we are pushing for.
Yeah, who are you to argue with them, indeed? They know what they need. Kira, as ever, thank you for updating us there from Kyiv, and apologies again for the signal breaking down, but we got it reinstalled, which is great. Thanks for your time. And, of course, more reaction as it comes through, and we'll update you, of course, with that training programme for those pilots as well. Also coming up here on GB News Live, should EU citizens be able to vote in a future general election even if they're not a citizen of the UK? Labour leader Keir Starmer thinks it's common sense. The Tories think he's trying to rig future elections. Who's right? We'll be discussing that in a moment.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to
to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to GB News Live. Sir Keir Starmer says it does not pass the common sense test that EU nationals who've lived in the UK long term cannot vote then in general elections. The Labour leader also said it was not such an outlandish idea to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to cast a ballot. He's confirmed the party is considering expanding the voting franchise. But the Tories have reacted by accusing him of trying to rig future elections by handing votes to those more likely to vote Labour. Well, let's speak to our Deputy Political Editor, Tom Harwood, once more, who joins us in the studio. Tom, let's just establish what the status of this is. It's not Labour policy, although it was in a policy document. They're just saying it's something that they're exploring, is that right?
That's right. This was never meant to be made public this weekend. This was a private Labour policy document that was leaked out and therefore has been splashed across the newspapers in various ways as people have sifted through it to find what policy sounds unusual or exciting. But the interesting thing is...
Or damaging.
Or perhaps damaging, if we're going to take a more cynical view of things. But the interesting thing here is that it's now been a few days since this policy document was leaked. And the most interesting point is where the Labour Party has not been walking away from these ideas, where they have been saying, yes, this is under active discussion. And, of course, no manifesto commitment has yet been published by the Labour Party. We know policy that they talk about, but, of course, the manifesto won't come out for another year or so. So all of this is under active discussion right now.
Yeah, the key to this seems to be the status of people being allowed to vote and whether an EU national is a citizen of Britain in terms of going to the ballot box. And certainly Greg Hands, the Conservative Party chairman, has reacted to this. No other EU country allows EU citizens who are not their nationals to vote in parliamentary elections. So even if you've got what's called settled status, you could be allowed to vote even though you're not technically a citizen of Britain.
Right, and that's an unusual state of affairs. If I were to move to the United States of America on a green card, I would not be allowed to vote for members of Congress or the president. If I became a citizen of the US, I would be allowed to vote for members of Congress or the president or the Senate or anything else. The curious change that Labour Party seems to be considering now is for the 3.4 million EU citizens who have decided not to become British citizens.
But even have lived here for a long time.
But may well have lived here for a long time. The Labour Party seems to be wanting them to vote. And to be fair, they can vote for devolved elections in Scotland and Wales. That was a recent change brought in those devolved administrations.
But you could have then the situation where someone, even though if they've lived here for a fixed amount of time and settled status and so on, they are still technically a citizen of France or Italy or of Spain. They vote then in a general election here, but we would not be allowed to vote as a British citizen in a French or Spanish or Italian election. The reverse process would not be allowed.
That's exactly the case. That could well be something that takes place. And interestingly, if someone, for example, lived part of their time in the United Kingdom and part of their time in another country, perhaps had achieved settled status here, you could, under some circumstances, imagine someone voting in both countries, which would be very curious. But ultimately, the current situation is, of course, migrants are allowed to vote if they become British citizens.
Yeah.
And of course, there are some other exceptions. Of course, Irish citizens are allowed to vote in UK elections due to the historical situation there. But it does seem that this would be out of line with what lots of other countries do.
Now, the other aspect is lowering the age from 18 to 17 or even 16. Not so outlandish, says Keir Starmer. But again, it's been a political hot potato, and many people have had questions on this in their British constitutional government A-level about voting age and so on. But the suggestion is that perhaps you could vote and you're not allowed to do other things that a government would actually institute as policy.
Yes, well, when the voting age was lowered to 18 in the 1960s, lots of liberalisations were happening in terms of the age at which people had sort of social freedoms and the rest of it. It seemed to be moving in that direction.
Dropped from 21 to 18 for lots of things.
Exactly. Curiously now, however, the age at which you're allowed to do things for many people is rising. We now have a situation where you have to show identification to buy a can of energy drink. We now have a situation whereby 16 and 17-year-olds, as of February this year, are not allowed to get married, even with parental consent. We've seen many different campaigns about raising the smoking age to 21, about raising the drinking age, about restricting the freedoms of people, even if they're 18, even if they're perhaps in their early 20s. We had that big debate about what a driving licence should allow someone to do under the age of 25. That's the whole conversation in terms of rights and responsibilities, except in this one area. This one area where people are saying that in order to vote, you can be even younger. And curiously, very often, it's the same sort of people who are saying no one should be able to gamble until they're 21, no one should be able to drink, no one should be able to smoke. They're saying that people should be able to vote to decide on that policy even younger. It seems
gamble with the country's future, some may say.
Some may say.
Tom, thank you very much for taking us through that. Well, let's talk about this in more detail now and speak to the data journalist, no less, at The Spectator magazine, Michael Simmons, who can join us. Michael, thank you very much for your time. Of course, the suggestion from the Tories is that this is all to enable Labour to garner more votes. I mean, is there any truth in that if you do the number crunching?
So I think in terms of the 16 and 17-year-olds, it's pretty obvious that this would potentially benefit Labour, because if we look at younger age groups, certainly in the 2019 election and indeed, in more recent polling, younger age groups overwhelmingly come out for the Labour Party or left or wing parties. So that kind of it's fair to make that accusation. Although that said, it's the total electorate at the last election was something like 43 million, and we're talking about 1.5 million people, so it's not clear how much of a difference it would make, but certainly that younger age group are more likely to go Labour.
Although I guess it could also blow up in their face a bit, in that many of these youngsters, increasingly voting Green, we're told.
Well, exactly. The stats on this are that they're not just going Labour Party, they're going to the parties to the left of Labour. I also think there's a higher risk on the EU citizens if that was your motivation, that you think they're going to vote Labour. I think it's far less clear-cut that migrant communities do vote for the Labour Party or left-wing parties. There's a lot of crossover to do with housing, and it's more likely that homeowners tend to vote Conservative because they have something to conserve, and renters are more likely to vote Labour. So I think the migrant stuff can get tied up in that. Certainly, the Tories might come back and say the biggest migrant group we've had in the last few years has been Indians, and Indians more and more seem to be Conservative voters, so they might say, hey, let's make it even easier for other migrants to come in. So I think if anyone's game here is to try and win the vote for them or get more votes for them, they're playing a dangerous game.
In terms of being attracted to a low-tax entrepreneurial economy, for instance?
Well, exactly. I think there's, certain migrant groups are more likely to be small business owners. They're family orientated, and they might be more likely to be Conservative. So it's just daft to say that one wider group is likely to, vote a certain way. The exception, of course, being that if this was with the EU in mind and looking at any sort of proposal at closer alignment to the EU, clearly it's fair to say that EU citizens are probably more likely to side with that. But if you're looking at wider general elections, it would just be daft to try and use it as any kind of gerrymander.
Yeah, in terms of political approach, it's a real sort of political hot potato to suggest that someone who's not a citizen of the UK could even then still vote in a British general election.
Yeah, I think this does seem a sort of odd proposal. As you were discussing before, there's no country in the EU, almost nowhere else, globally, that would allow non-citizens to vote. And I think, it's perfectly reasonable to say that people who have come here, have paid tax and, worked for years, can apply to become citizens. And once they're citizens, I think most people would say, go ahead and vote. But when you're a non-citizen, it does seem bizarre, the concept of being able to vote.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for taking us through the numbers. And, of course, we'll see if it does become policy or whether it's just a suggestion as to knock it about a bit in terms of the Labour Party. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Michael. Now, let's just update you here on GB News that we have got the Trade Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, heading to Switzerland for post-Brexit trade talks. What could she be coming back with? Well, Liam's the man to know because he's been in touch with her to find out. So we'll hear it from the horse's mouth. All that coming up with On the Money. First, let's get an update on the latest news headlines with Tamsin.
Mark, thank you. Here are the headlines from the GB Newsroom at 2:31. The UK is to start training Ukrainian pilots to fly Western fighter jets in the summer. The Prime Minister has met Ukrainian President Zelenskyy at Chequers, but said that providing warplanes wasn't straightforward. The Prime Minister has compared President Zelenskyy's wartime leadership to that of Winston Churchill. The meeting comes as the UK has pledged to send hundreds of new long-range attack drones to Ukraine.
One thing we will be doing, starting actually relatively soon, is training of Ukrainian pilots, and that's something that we've discussed today. We're ready to implement those plans in relatively short order, which will mean that we're training Ukrainian citizens to become absolutely combat-ready aircraft pilots.
The Home Secretary is urging the government to stick to its manifesto pledge of reducing overall migration. In a speech at the National Conservatism Conference, Suella Braverman is arguing the UK should train its own workforce of lorry drivers and fruit pickers and be less dependent on low-skilled foreign labour. That's ahead of official figures which are expected to show net migration at a record high of between 650,000 and 1 million people within the last year. A ballot on industrial action by senior doctors in England has opened. The British Medical Association says talks with the government to try and resolve the long-running pay dispute remain deadlocked. The Health Department says consultants were given a 4.5% pay rise last year and is urging them to carefully consider the effect of further strikes on patients. The ballot will close at the end of June. Meanwhile, 2 teachers' unions have opened new ballots on further strike action. It's after members of the National Association of Head Teachers and the National Education Union rejected the latest pay offer from the government. Voting will close at the end of July, with potential strike action to take place in the autumn term. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2505 and 1.15 euros. The price of gold is £1,612 and 99 pence per ounce, and the FTSE 100's at 7,776 points.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for physical investment.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Britain is watching.
And welcome back to GB News Live. Now, let's just update you on Suella Braverman's speech to this National Conservative conference. So we're being told it's been interrupted by two protesters as she took to the dais, identifying themselves as members of Extinction Rebellion. They've been removed from the hall by security, and she went on then to give her speech in which she said Conservatives were sceptical of self-appointed gurus, experts and elites. The Home Secretary telling the conference that Conservative prized experience, judgment and wisdom, saying she would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the telephone directory than by the Harvard University faculty. Going on to say common sense and a shared understanding of who we are and what we really matters in life have vastly more to recommend themselves than does anything that emanates from an ivory tower. And of course, she is expected to speak on the issue of migration. We'll update you as that comes in. Elsewhere, the Business and Trade Secretary, Cammy Badenoch, is in Switzerland today for post-Brexit trade talks. But the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, Nick Thomas-Simon, says when it comes to trade, the government is big on promises and appallingly low on delivery. Is that accurate? Let's speak now to our economics and business producer or editor, Liam Halligan, joins us with On the Money. Well, someone trying to demote you there on the script, but there we are. You are the editor. You are the man who knows.
I'm a man of many talents, Mark. Can I get your coffee?
Yeah. Actually, you can. No. Let's talk about Switzerland and what's happening at the moment, because you've been in touch with the Trade Secretary on this, which I think the estimate, it could be beneficial to about 7.4 million just at the moment in terms of UK trade deals, because obviously we still have something that dates back to 1970 or 1972 in place with Switzerland.
Yeah, so a key point to grab is that you don't need a trade deal to trade with countries. We have a lot of trade with the US. It's our biggest single country trading partner, almost a fifth of our trade here in the UK, and we don't have a trade deal. So you trade under what's called WTO rules, the general rules around the world.
Which can cost quite a lot in terms of...
There are tariffs and there are quotas, so they are limitations or costs that domestic politicians impose on trade from overseas to protect their domestic producers. When you've got a free trade agreement, most of those tariffs and quotas disappear, and you get the beneficial mutual gains from trade. Now, the UK has actually signed quite a few trade deals of our own since we left the European Union, because, of course, when we were in their customs union. The European Union did all our trade deals for us. Here's a list of just the main ones that I've got here, Mark. So in October 2020, we signed a free trade agreement with Japan, obviously after Brexit. That's the third biggest economy in the world. Then with the European Union itself later that year. Then we signed a free trade agreement with our old trading allies, the Aussies, in the middle of 21 and Kiwis in February 2022. Then in March this year, the really big one, the CPTPP. What's that, Mark? It's the Comprehensive Progressive Trade and Pacific Partnership. This is a trade deal that comprises 11 Pacific Rim nations. We're talking about some big economies: Mexico, Canada, the Japanese, again. Other big Asian countries are going to join that. The South Koreans are going to join that quite soon. They're, again, another major economy. So we've got deals now with 71 countries. Some of those are bespoke post-Brexit deals. Other ones are deals that we've just inherited from the European Union, which our Trade Secretary and civil servants will gradually get round to renegotiating so they reflect the UK's interests, not the European Union's.
I mean, there were critics of that Pacific Rim deal saying, well, it's only going to add less than 1% of GDP to the UK. Those figures were disputed, of course.
They were absolutely dismissed as, quotes, ridiculous by the Trade Secretary herself. They use very old assumptions about you trade mostly with the countries that are near to you. Well, we don't, because we're less a manufacturing exporter than we are a services exporter. Yeah. When you're acting as a lawyer or an architect, or you're creating, electronic games, financial services, all kinds of other high-tech stuff, then you don't need those countries to be near you. You just need to be on the internet. Yeah. So a lot of our trade is far-flung. That's why a lot of people who back Brexit think that the UK should be trading a lot more with where the bulk of the world population is, around the Pacific Rim, around China, India, and all the rest of it. It's not straightforward, but that is where the growth is in the future.
And we got Liz Truss, who's on another mission, basically questioning whether we should actually tie up with China because of these issues. But I mean, we joked earlier about cuckoo clocks and chocolate.
We were talking about The Third Man, weren't we? The Carol Reed movie.
However, you've touched on an interesting point there, bearing in mind this deal with Switzerland dates so far back, because most of this is about digital trade and data innovation. So we actually need these sort of electronic channels, if you like.
This is how we do most of our trade in services. It's not just financial services, it's legal services, it's insurance, it's all kinds of consultancy. And let's just take a little look here at Switzerland. I've got some more numbers. We are joking sort of fondly. We have a real close relationship with the Swiss, don't we, about cuckoo clocks and Roger Federer and all the rest of it. Look, Switzerland is the UK's 10th largest trading partner, right? It's a big economy, even though it's a small place on the map with lots of mountains. It's the top 20 global economy. It's like always 18th, 19th or 20th biggest economy in the world, which is astonishing when you think it's such a small country. We do £53 billion of trade a year with Switzerland. This is major. They're not in the European Union, of course. They never joined the European Union after many referendums. They didn't want to. They wanted their independence. And as you rightly say, Mark, the existing trade deal does date from the early 1970s, so it doesn't include anything about services at all. And when I've been in touch with Kemi Badenoch in the run-up to the Swiss trip, and indeed today, she's saying, rightly, that the Swiss and the Brits, we are two services superpowers. We are the second biggest exporter of services in the world after the United States, and the Swiss are the biggest exporter of services per head. So the fact that we haven't got a trade deal where we can trade services between each other freely is a big issue. And this is a benefit from Brexit. If we can get this trade deal, this is something that we didn't have under EU rules.
But concerns in those services, particularly the financial sector, because of what's happened with the Swiss banking, a couple of months ago now, of course, there are real problems. I mean, how robust is their financial situation, given what happened?
You're right to point that out. Credit Suisse, which is one of the major, what we call systemically important banks in the world, it was exposed to rising interest rates. The value of its bond portfolio was plummeting, as you and I have explained many times here on GB News. But the bank was taken over by another major Swiss bank, UBS, and for now it seems OK. Look, we're raising interest rates very, very quickly. There are creaks and cracks appearing in banking systems all over the world, not least in the US. It's not as if we're going to stop trading with the US, is it? The world's biggest economy. It's not as if we wouldn't do a trade deal with the US.
Well, the problems with Federal Reserve Bank.
If we got the opportunity. So Switzerland is a global centre of banking, as is the City of London, as is New York. There are going to be issues with banking systems when you raise interest rates sharply. I don't think that's a reason not to do a trade deal. And personally speaking, an opinion here, I would say if we can get this trade deal with Switzerland, that'll be a major feather in the cap of this government at a time when it needs some good news.
Yeah, absolutely. Liam, as ever, thank you for taking us through that. But let's now speak to a trade economist, fellow at the Centre for Brexit Policy, Catherine McBride, who can join us. Catherine, just to pick up on what Liam was saying there, I mean, could this actually perhaps open a few other doors in terms of international trade deals?
Well, as Liam has already said, we've had a trade deal with Switzerland for a long time. But all trade deals need to be updated regularly to make up for new types of trade, new ways of doing trade. And with Switzerland, a lot of our trade is financial services, and that has changed out of sight in the last 50 years. So it's perfectly normal for the government to update a trade deal. And it's very good that they are doing this and doing this for Switzerland. For a long time, we did, when Brexit first happened, there was a movement with the Swiss to form an alliance with the British. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm sorry that I'm at a conference where Suella Braverman's been speaking, and she's obviously just finished. And I came out to talk to you, but it looks like everyone's coming out now.
Yeah, because we know there have been a few protesters at the beginning of her speech, so it's been a bit noisy there. Anyway, we will stay with you. Just to intervene and ask you, why do you think it's taken so long, 1970, 1972 originally, before the internet was even invented? Why has it taken us so long to get back to this stage and look at the deal again?
Well, it was under the control of the EU, and Switzerland has about 120 different agreements with the EU. So it never had a single trade deal. And so consequently, they they were actually trying to get the Swiss, force the Swiss to have a single deal. And that meant that the Swiss had to, they were fighting back against that. And there was a time when the EU removed what we call equivalency from Switzerland. Yeah. And stop them actually being able to trade shares, Europeans being able to trade on the Swiss exchanges. Switzerland and the UK did think about putting together an alliance with Singapore and the US and possibly Japan, because all of those countries really control financial services, especially for fund management. And this is something that was talked about a lot. And hopefully we'll be able to do it now that we're out of the EU. But for a long time, the EU was in charge of our trade deal with Switzerland.
Is there a danger, as I was picking up with Liam, in terms of centring so much on the financial services sector, bearing in mind, as we were just discussing, what happened with the Swiss banks?
Well, actually, Credit Suisse, though I hate to disagree with Liam, but it was an international bank. And a lot of its problems weren't to do with its life in Switzerland, but its life in America. And so is UBS, by the way. UBS is also a very big international bank. So that isn't so much a Swiss problem as it is international finances. Yeah, yeah. And in a way, all banks should be like that, where they have to manage their own risk. And banks shouldn't be being bailed out all the time by governments. A bank should be able to look at its own risk portfolio, manage its own bond market. Unfortunately, we have a whole generation of bond traders who've never seen an interest rate above 2% before. And so suddenly they're having trouble getting to grips with what's going on in the markets. But hopefully that will all get sorted out. But Switzerland is still a great trading partner for us, and they are buying more of our goods. And we saw immediately after Brexit that a lot of goods that we thought we were selling to the EU were actually going to Switzerland. So that now that we have to fill in customs regulations, that they were just being transported via France. And the same with on the way back. They're also one of our biggest buyers of gold, because the UK, the physical gold market internationally is based in London. And the Swiss also do a lot of physical gold trade, so that we've always done a lot of that trade between them. Yeah. And that's a big part of what we sell to them.
Oh, there we are. Selling gold to the Swiss. What could be better? Catherine, thanks for joining us there, and we managed to hear you loud and clear, so thanks very much indeed for that. OK. There we are. Okay, so it's not just chocolate and cuckoo clocks, it's gold too. Now, we've seen driverless cars, driverless trains. Now, driverless buses starting running between Fife and Edinburgh Park Station today, a 14-mile route being served by 5 single-decker autonomous buses, as they're called. Well, joining us once more, our Scotland reporter Tony Maguire, who's been updating us on it. And we say driverless, Tony, but we've seen a driver in the cab, even though he's not got his hands on the wheel. And we've got a captain as well inside the bus, which sounds very grand.
Yes, aye, Captain, indeed. The passengers seem to enjoy the whole experience, though. It definitely, the passengers coming off the bus and talking to me, you know, they feel like this is something different. It feels very futuristic. The driver is there, you know, we would imagine as a safety precaution, just in case he needs to take the wheel. But otherwise, the bus goes about 90% of the route between Fife and Edinburgh completely autonomously. There's a couple of dings just to let the passenger know when the AI is taken over, and there it goes. But as I said, I did speak to some of the passengers, and I'd just like to maybe share some of their thoughts with you just now. Tell me about your experience on the bus today.
It was excellent. Yeah, I was quite confident. I wasn't worried at all. Lots of reassurance, and if anything, I probably expected it, and it was safer than it would be with just a normal driver, because I knew they'd be taking loads of safety precautions, so I wasn't worried at all.
Because at the moment you've got the 2 members of staff on board rather than just the 1 driver, so clearly that's not sustainable, but we'll wait and see how it goes.
When was the last time you rode a bus with a bus conductor on it?
Oh, it's probably still in short trousers.
The thing goes beep, and I think they call it the captain, the guy on board who's just looking after the passengers, says we're now in autonomous mode, and you just go, oh, this is great fun, you know, burling along, you know, controlled by a machine rather than a human being. But you know, you've got the driver there with his hands on the wheel just in case.
The captain and the driver are very friendly, kept us up to date with the journey, told us at which points the bus was driving on its own, and I definitely one of the most interesting bus journeys I've done in a long time.
And certainly, you know, the passengers coming on all had big smiles on their faces, and who wouldn't? Essentially, they drove the biggest sitting iPad on the roads right now. The buses have cameras, radar, LiDAR, and of course that AI processing it the whole way along the journey. So this is really phase 1. This is where it journeys between Fife and Edinburgh. Soon we'll see that journey extended to include Dunfermline, just along the Forth. And then further down the line, we will see nobody sitting in that hot seat, Mark. There'll be no driver there taking the wheel, and we will move to fully autonomous transport. Still quite a while away. AB1, the route as it's called just now, the trial is going to go until 2025. But certainly in the testing phase, the fact I found most interesting was that it's done 1 million miles of trial test. So certainly everybody going on feels safe, and they come off feeling a lot safer.
And it arrived on time as well, we understand. So there's a first for a bus anyway. Thank you very much indeed for updating us on that. And of course, we'll continue to see how it's rolled out. The driverless bus, even though it's got a driver sitting there. That's it from us for now, but Patrick's with you for the afternoon to take you through particularly Suella Braverman's speech. She was interrupted by protesters, but she has been able to speak, keep you updated on that. The latest we understand from that speech, she's saying the state cannot legislate away differences, but can create a level playing field. The Home Secretary telling the audience of the National Conservatism Conference, one thing we do not wish to is conserve someone's life circumstances. More on that. Stay with us. The weather's next.
Afternoon, I'm Alex Deakin, and this is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Most of us will stay dry for the rest of this week. There'll be a few showers around, but generally sunny spells. And yes, it is pretty fresh at the moment, but it will be turning a little warmer. This area of high pressure is slowly building in across the country. This weather front brought some rain overnight that cleared away from Kent this morning, leaving behind sunny spells and just a few showers, but still 1 or 2 heavy ones around this evening over parts of northeast England and southern Scotland. They are going to fade away, so most will have a dry night and clear spells. means it is going to be quite chilly. Later in the night, cloud and patchy rain will spread into the far north, keeping the temperatures up here, but elsewhere down to single figures, and in some spots actually pretty close to freezing in the countryside. So a chilly start to Tuesday for sure, but generally a bright one with quite a bit of sunshine. Cloud and patchy rain across northern Scotland. That will spread south, so a few showers turning up through the central belts late morning onwards. And then later in the day, we could see a few more showers coming into southern Scotland, perhaps northeast England, but pretty well scattered. Most places dry. Yes, some cloud, but some sunny spells. Temperatures in the south similar to today, 18 or 19. Further north, 16. Again, pretty low for the time of year, a touch below average. During the evening, still a few of those showers scattered across northeastern parts of England, tending to fade, again disappearing by midnight. So again, for the vast majority, it'll be dry as we go into Wednesday morning. And again, many places starting off with some sunshine. A bit more cloud and rain again spilling into the northwest during Wednesday. Some rain arriving here, but for most, it's dry. Greater chance of a few more showers over eastern England, but even here I think they'll be pretty well scattered during Wednesday in most places. Staying dry and bright with sunny spells. Temperatures again around or a touch below average, but they are starting to creep up and it will get a little warmer as this week goes on.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories.